The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Specific for OSHPD 3 clinics. And today we will cover fire clearance for care facilities, code application notice 172100, California medical clinic guidelines for plan review, approval, inspection, and certifications, and much more. Again, this is the second part of the two-part series. If you missed the part one, it has been recorded and it will be uploaded to the HCAI website in approximately 4 to 5 weeks, following closed captioning and website accessibility. This part two is being recorded as well and also be available in about 4 to 5 weeks. If you haven't done so, feel free to download the PDF copy of this presentation available to you in the Go-To toolbox under the handout section. We're scheduled to be here for 3 hours, which includes a question and answer session throughout the presentation and at the end. If you have a question during the presentation, please type question into the question section of the Go-To panel, and we will answer them the best we can. Please be sure to keep your question generic, but if you have a specific question about a specific project, please feel free to email your question over to the regs unit, and the email is regsunit@hcai.ca.gov, regsunit@hcai.ca.gov. If the presentation experiences transmission difficulties, please log out and log back in using the same login information sent by the Go-To software when you register for the presentation. And if we will do the same, if you have the experience of the same issues, we will do the same on our side. Today, for presenter, we have Gary Dunger, Executive Director of Design and Construction at Cedars-Sinai, Nancy Timmins, Chief Fire, Life and Safety Officer here at HCAI, and David Coram, Superintendent of Building and Safety with the City of Long Beach. In the background, helping answer questions will be the rest of HCAI. And once again, thank you for joining us today. So without further ado, I hand the presentation over to you, Gary.
Thank you, Monica, and good morning, everybody. Welcome back to session number 2. Hope a lot of you joined us last week or the day before yesterday on Tuesday for part 1. Part 2 will be a little more detailed and a little more into the actual design requirements for clinics and their relationship to OSHPD 3. This presentation is not advancing. Here we go. Sorry. Sorry about that. This presentation does offer continuing education credits through AIA California. Don will receive a certificate at the end of the presentations. You can use that certificate to obtain your continuing education credits. If you are logging on as a group and there are a group of people in your room, each individual person will need to self-report to AIA to receive your continuing education credits. Monica already introduced our panel of speakers. My name is Gary Dunger. I am an executive director at Cedars-Sinai, formerly with OSHPD, so I have a little bit of experience with clinics and with OSHPD 3, particularly in my new role. My cohort and partner here is Nancy Timmons. Nancy is a Chief Fire and Life Safety Officer with OSHPD, formerly a Deputy State Fire Marshal for the state of Michigan and a firefighter in the Michigan. She's been with OSHPD 16 years as a Fire and Life Safety Chief, and bosses me around pretty regularly. David Curran is also joining us. David is our Superintendent of Building and Safety with the City of Long Beach. David is a professional engineer, architect, and has over 20 years as a chief building official for City of Long Beach, as well as other city jurisdictions in California. Richard Tannehill, we wore Richard out. Richard's the Deputy Division Chief and won't be able to join us today because he did a webinar Tuesday, he did a webinar yesterday, he's doing one in person tomorrow, so we gave him the day off and let him pass. That's the group. Again, if you have questions while we present, feel free to type them into the question box on the GoToWebinar software program, and we will have breaks at key points to go through any of the questions that you might have. So without further ado, I'm going to jump in and talk a little bit about what's going on in healthcare. I'm sure everybody out there probably has an understanding of this and maybe even know it better than I do, but talking about how the future of healthcare relates to this topic of clinics. We know in the healthcare business that the future of healthcare is going to be dealing and taking care of an older population. A couple of statistics here because we love statistics. Within the next 10 years, there will be 1 billion older people worldwide. By the year 2050, the population of 65 and older is projected to be 83.7 million in the United States. And this little animation right here, I found very intriguing because it's showing that as the years pass, there are fewer and fewer younger people in the United States and more older people. Not only are there more older people, but the people are living much longer. And what does that translate to, and why does that affect what we're talking about? Well, in this particular little slide, the cost of healthcare is really sort of what we're talking about. And if I look at the cost of care per day, slide across the bottom, versus quality of life on the left, didn't mean to go there, as the acuity of older folks deteriorates, where they will receive healthcare will increase or get more and more expensive as it progresses. Of course, home healthcare is always the best option, and moving then into some form of a residential application, whether it's assisted living or some sort of a skilled nursing, is the next level of acuity, with the cost increasing significantly. And then as we move into the specialty clinic, which is what we'll talk a lot about today, and into the community hospital and ultimately into the ICU setting, the cost per day increases pretty dramatically. So as we see more and more older people needing healthcare, this is going to put more and more tax and on the healthcare system. And there's a statement from George Halverson, who was the chairman of Kaiser Permanente years ago, that sort of drives this all to the point of healthcare in the hospital setting. The way to get costs lower is to move farther from the hospital setting. So what does that mean? Well, it for sure is going to talk about clinics and the clinic setting and providing healthcare to the population in a non-hospital but healthcare-minded setting. So I'm going to pass to Nancy now. She's going to talk a little bit about responsibilities, right?
Yep, and you'll hear Gary and I just go back and forth. We'll do it in a little style, and so you'll hear us just go back and forth with this. But in talking about the OSHPD 3, the clinics, remember, it gets confusing with, what is what? What's an OSHPD 3? What type of clinic? What's the occupancy? And OSHPD 3 is is the building classification. So keeping that in mind when you're moving forward with thinking about these clinics and what occupancy is. A lot of people use OSHPD 3 interchangeably with occupancy. Just remember, that's not the occupancy, that's a building classification. We'll get into the occupancy type in a little bit. Some of what adds to the confusion of clinics, besides what occupancy is, it is who does what with this. And there's so much, there's a lot of regulation, of course, for these facilities. So breaking it down just a little bit, there's more to it than this with different accreditations and such. But for CDPH, they'll evaluate the operational side, the programs and operations, and they conduct surveys for the compliance with NFPA 101 and NFPA 99. And they also, of course, issue the license, the CDPH license. And then OSHPD, we write the regs for this, and then we do review the construction drawings for OSHPD 3 certification upon request. And we'll also get into that a little bit more later as well. Upon request, so the owner is going to have will choose between, is it going to OSHPD in certain cases, is it going to OSHPD or will it be going to locals? Again, we'll get into that a little bit later. Then you have the SFM side, the State Fire Marshal side, who also writes regs and is also looking at the Title 19, the California Code of Regulations, Public Safety Standards, in addition to the Fire Life Safety Code requirements that you're familiar with. And then you also have local. So, and depending what area and what community, what city you're from or working with, you have local building department and local fire authority. And they might be same, they might be split up. So local building department will do the plan review and inspection for compliance with the codes, with the regs, and including the OSHPD 3 requirements. But then the local fire authority will inspect for compliance with the fire code and Title 19, and they also issue the fire clearance. So you can see how this piece alone can be confusing, but we have this here just to break that up a little bit for you. Speaking of the fire clearance, with the Form 850, this is a form that the local fire will have to sign off on. And this is not a form this doesn't come from OSHPD. Some individuals believe that this comes from OSHPD, but the Form 850 does not come from OSHPD. It's part of CDPH, and it's needed for the application for the license. In order to get that license, this has to be included with that, the sign off here. So the locals will give a fire clearance prior to the licensing and they'll have to fill out this form. Oops.
And the special note here is who issues the form? Who actually completes the form and gives it to the fire department? As an owner or as an operator of the clinic, you can complete the Form 850 and issue it to the fire department. Now, we've experienced cases in the past where the fire department said, we won't respond to requests from facilities. The 850 form has to come from CDPH. So this is actually a letter from CDPH to all the fire authorities in the state that basically says licensing and certification will accept forms that are initiated by the healthcare providers. So, however, if the fire department is being sticklers and saying, no, we're not going to accept it, then you can submit it to CDPH and they will forward it to the fire department from there. And that way you can get that Form 850 completed and signed. This is a Q&A from CDPH that basically says what I just explained. Question 13, what can I do if the fire inspector will only accept the Form 850 from California Department of Public Health? So, their response is, if you submit it to us, we will forward it to the fire department and request the Form 850 be completed.
This is a sample of the form. Here, I'll take you through some steps with this. It's pretty short and sweet.
Yeah, this side's mostly about when the form is required, whether it falls under, from the fire service standpoint, a state mandated annual inspection requirement. The I-2.1 occupancies do not. And the next question that the fire departments will often ask is, can they charge a fee for the inspections conducted? And the answer is yes, they can charge a fee to the owner. So please be aware of that. The fee is usually not very extensive, but that potential is out there. So moving on, last Tuesday, if you attended Tuesday, Richard went over the code application notice for OSHPD 3, and it's sufficiently confusing enough, we think, that it's probably worth just quickly revisiting it and maybe breaking down some of it. And rather than reading all of the slides, of course, the language here comes actually from the CAN. And I love the first bullet point, the determination of which clinics and outpatient facilities are subject to OSHPD 3 is an interesting statement right from the CAN, and maybe a bit of an understatement, because these things certainly are complex, we know that. And of course, the confusion exists because we refer to clinics and outpatient facilities sort of synonymously, and sometimes the doctor's office might be called a clinic when it really doesn't apply to what we're talking about here. So terminology becomes very, very important. And the key point here that we continue to underscore is that OSHPD 3 applies to licensed clinics that are licensed under the Health and Safety Code Section 1200 or Section 1250. 1200 is for clinics, and 1250 would be clinics under hospital service, under hospital license, excuse me. So in an effort, of course, to make this very simple, and those of you that know Alicia Wachtel, she loves this particular flowchart. OSHPD loves flowcharts, and we created a very simple and easy to follow flowchart. This is like one of my favorites. And while it's a little daunting at first, we're going to break it down and talk about each of the sections individually and then give some examples.
So, like Gary said, yeah, there's a lot to this when you're looking at it as one big picture, but just, start with one. And your question is the building intended to be licensed by CDPH? If it's no, it's super easy. So if it's no, you're then determine what is this? Is it the doctor's office? And you're going that route. Locals will plan review it, issue the permit, do the inspection, and approval to Title 24, excluding OSHPD 3, because it's not licensed, so it's not OSHPD 3. And then if it's not licensed by CDPH, it's not a doctor's office, but it's an ambulatory surgical center that's certified for Medicare. Then again, goes to locals for the review, permit, inspection, and after that, CDPH will come in and conduct a survey for fire life safety requirements that are found in 101, NFPA 101, that are requirements to participate with CMS. So
the key point here, of course, is that it's not licensed. And interestingly, you can have a surgery center that is not licensed by California Department of Public Health. So they refer to those as ambulatory surgery centers in the code. And that does not mean these are not regulated. They do not have to comply with the OSHPD 3 provisions, but they are well regulated. They have to be accredited. Part of the conditions of participation for most of the accrediting agencies requires compliance with many of the local codes. And some of the stuff we're going to talk about today is the difference between occupancy classifications, which will be required whether the facility is licensed or not. So that's where the sort of the key important part of this presentation comes in. So ambulatory surgery centers still have to comply with a lot of the MEP requirements, particularly mechanical requirements in ASHRAE 170. So we're not going to talk a lot about those today because we're going to focus on OSHPD 3, but this is something that to be aware of, because in all reality, the movement in the healthcare industry right now is to move away from licensed facilities and create these as ambulatory surgery centers. So I have some pictures because I love pictures. Here's one of our most recent clinics that we opened up, and looking at it from the outside, it's a beautiful building. The artwork is amazing, but it says urgent care on the side of the building in big letters. is this a licensed facility or not? Well, of course, you can't really tell. Is it an ambulatory surgery center? Well, this is what the floor plan looks like, and we'll do a little walkthrough very quickly. And you can see that it's filled with a lot of exam rooms, a procedure room, which might be something to be concerned about, another procedure room, but mostly it's going to be exam rooms. So does this fall into an ambulatory surgery center setting? Probably not. So this is an excellent example of a non-licensed clinic that does not need to meet OSHPD 3 provisions and would effectively be regulated as a doctor's office. So moving to the next section of the flow chart.
So again, we started with that question number one, right? Is the building intended to be licensed by CDPH? We went through, if no, it's not, it still has an occupancy with requirements that need to be met, but it's not an OSHPD 3. So now say, yep, it's going to be licensed. And then the next question is the clinic under a CDPH hospital license. So if the answer is yes, then we go this route. And if it is under a hospital license, is it a hospital building under the 1250, that the health and safety code section that Gary mentioned earlier, or is it a non-hospital building, a freestanding clinic that's under health and safety code? It's also under health and safety code 1250, but is it freestanding or is it a hospital building? So if it's a hospital building, then OSHPD does that review, including, of course, OSHPD 1. If it's a non-hospital building and a freestanding clinic, then the owner decides who the plan review agency is going to be. Is it going to be OSHPD or is it going to be local building jurisdiction? If it's OSHPD, then again, we'll review, certify, permit, do the construction observation and approval to the code, including OSHPD 3 requirements. And then that freestanding clinic remains under OSHPD jurisdiction until we're notified by the owner. So if the owner decides instead, we're not giving it to OSHPD, we're going to give it to, we want the locals to do this, then it goes to the locals, and the locals have to determine, will they provide certification to OSHPD 3? If yes, then they will be doing all of that. They'll do the plan review, the certifying, the permit, the inspection and approval in accordance with the code and OSHPD 3 requirements. If they will not certify to OSHPD 3, then OSHPD will review to the OSHPD 3 requirements only, and then the locals will review to everything else within the building code except OSHPD 3. So that piece gets a little bit confusing there, but again, the point is, what is it? Is it a hospital building, or is it a freestanding clinic? And then whose will it be? Will it be OSHPD's? And then for locals, will they take on enforcing the OSHPD 3 requirements, or will that be handed off to OSHPD and then they do the rest?
So here's another example of a similar building from the previous example. This is a building in Torrance at the Torrance Memorial Medical Center. It says urgent care on the side of the building as well. But where does the license come from? Is this licensed, yes or no? In this particular case, it is licensed. And then the next question is, what license does it fall under? Is it under a Section 1200 clinic license or a license of the hospital? So in this case, it falls under Section 1250 because it's a licensed service of the hospital. And the floor plan looks a little similar and a little different. So when I start seeing things like, I still saw some procedure rooms, but when I start seeing recovery rooms and when I start seeing pre-op rooms, that to me tells me it's a different use altogether and probably going to be regulated differently. So these are examples of that can fall into each of these categories.
So going back to the flow chart, asking that question, is the clinic under a CDPH hospital license? We just said, all right, we went through, yes, it is. What do we do then? So now I say, is it under CDPH hospital license? Is it a licensed freestanding specialty clinic, or is it a licensed primary care clinic? So a licensed freestanding specialty clinic can be either the chronic dialysis and surgery clinic or the rehab clinic and the alternate birthing centers. If it's a licensed primary, well, we'll get to that one in a minute. So let's say it's a licensed freestanding specialty clinic and it's dialysis and or surgery clinic. The owner requests the plan review agency again. Is it going to be OSHPD? Is it going to be local? So that's similar to what we just went through. And then if it's a rehab clinic or an alternate birthing center, then locals will plan review, permit, and inspect and improve that. Those plans, sorry, I just think I need to back up a minute here. No, it's okay. So then if it's a licensed primary care clinic, those include the community free employee, the eye doctor, and the psychology clinics. And locals will review and permit that. And I think, oh, you know what, I did forget, that's what I do. The one last piece. So if we went to the licensed freestanding, and it's one of those, the dialysis or the surgery or the rehab, or excuse me, the dialysis or surgery, if you go all the way through, follow that flow chart all the way through, they do end up with the CDPH portion as well. That CDPH will have to conduct a survey for the surgical and dialysis clinics only, and they will review that to the 101, NFPA 101 requirements.
So the distinction here is, as you follow this flow chart, only dialysis and surgery clinics will get an OSHPD review for OSHPD 3 and certification. If it's a rehab clinic or an alternate primary care clinic, local jurisdictions must do the plan review, permitting, inspection, and certification to OSHPD 3. It cannot be done by OSHPD. So this is an example of a hospital building where acute care services were removed, and now they want to add some new services. And part of the questioning here is, what category would this fall under? Now, it looks like it's infusion, so it's probably some sort of apheresis or something else, but I also have a children's pediatric dialysis here. So there's something going on here. This lends itself to, obviously, dialysis, which would fall under that OSHPD jurisdictional aspect of it. And OSHPD could be requested by the owner to provide OSHPD 3 certification for this. Confused? Yeah, this is real simple stuff, right?
Which will help sort out with like the occupancy that we mentioned earlier. We'll get to that in a little bit of what do you call it? Where OSHPD 3 again, some building classification, but what is the use? What's the occupancy? So we'll help sort that through that in a bit too.
So sort of a bring it all home slide. Is this clinic going to be licensed? If the answer is yes, is it licensed under Section 1250 or Section 1200 of the Health and Safety Code? If the answer is no, then it is not subject to OSHPD 3 requirements. And the clinic still, however, before, including all the various different parts. So that's enough for the flow chart. I know that everybody is sad to leave that section. I know I am, but we're going to move on towards other cool and fun stuff and talking about the health facilities design and the aspects of concern or requirements that you need to be aware of as you prepare plans and documents and build these buildings.
So as you're familiar with, or may be familiar with, effective use of the code, where do you find that in the code? Writing a paper, you have an outline of what are the points, what are the topics, what are the specific points to it. In the very beginning portion of the code, you'll see this effective use of the code in the front there, and it just helps lay out what are the things you'll be looking at. What do you want to start with first? And of course, what is the building's, what's the occupancy? Who's going to be in there? What are they doing? How long are they there for? What's being done to them? So classifying the building for occupancy, and then also construction type, the construction type based on the occupancy. And there's more to it, of course. And then is the building going to be fully sprinklered or not? Partially sprinklered is, well, that's a whole other thing. I'm going to other lessons. So determine if the building's fully sprinklered or not. Where is the building on the site? What's the allowable size that building can be based on its occupancy and construction type? Are there any special detailed occupancy requirements for that occupancy, like your chapter 4 information? And then identifying and evaluating fire and smoke protective elements and any additional fire protection systems that may be required. We'll get into some of that later as well. What materials can be used for interior finish? Of course, looking at means of egress provisions. And then what are some other miscellaneous provisions that may come into play, such as we're familiar with from the other day, your chapter 12 requirements.
So starting with, the outline that Nancy just went through is how we laid out this particular presentation. So we'll follow sort of that effective use of the code model. But to sort of set the stage, why are we talking, what's unique about healthcare facilities? Why are they different from all the other types of buildings that we build? Well, of course, there are various different special hazards associated with healthcare that are unique. People hazards, of course, patients that are incapable of unassisted self-preservation, patients that may be restrained or locked into rooms. There's some security considerations for emergency departments, labor delivery, et cetera. There are also occupancy-related hazards. We have operating rooms that have some interesting procedures happening. Oxygen is a hazardous material that can influence fire behavior. Oxygen enriched atmospheres using lasers is always a bit of a fun time as well. And then radiology has some challenges that we'll talk a little bit about, and the associated hazards going with radiology that we kind of take for granted.
Okay, so
starting from the beginning.
Starting with the first, with occupancy, who's in our building? How do we classify this building? So is it going to be a B or an I21? And you come down to three choices, essentially. You're either going to be a B, there are two types of Bs, or an I21. So starting with the B occupancy, it's the ambulatory care facilities that serve 5 or fewer patients. So what's an ambulatory care facility? And then you see the definition there. That's from chapter 2. Of course, we don't enforce that, but man, if you don't go into chapter 2, please do. So words mean things. That's a lot of good information there. So what is an ambulatory care facility? It's buildings or portions thereof used to provide medical, surgical, psychiatric, nursing, or similar care on a less than 24-hour basis to persons who are rendered incapable of self-preservation by the services provided, or staff has accepted responsibility for care recipients already incapable. So if we say your ambulatory care facility, less than 24 hours. If it's more than, obviously that doesn't fit here. That doesn't belong in a B. So less than 24 hours. And then the individuals in the space, they're either rendered incapable of self-preservation by what's happening to them in that space. That sounds bad. Or the staff have taken responsibility for those care recipients that are already incapable of self-preservation. So again, that's 5 or fewer. But then what if it's more? See right in here that if it's 6 or more patients, the code leads you to an I21. But we aren't quite there yet, because remember, there are 2 types of Bs that the clinic could potentially be. So the first is the ambulatory care. The second would be an outpatient clinic that's not classified as an I21. So again, from chapter 2, what's an outpatient clinic? It's buildings or portions thereof used to provide medical care on, again, less than 24-hour basis to persons who are not classified as non-ambulatory or bedridden, or not rendered incapable of self-preservation by the services provided. So again, less than 24 hours, but these people can get up, get out better than the others. I21. Now we're to that. What's an I21? It's a healthcare facility that receives persons for outpatient medical care that may render the patient incapable of unassisted, added a word there, that may render the patient incapable of unassisted preservation and where each tenant space accommodates more than 5 such patients. So more than 5, they have care that may render them incapable of unassisted preservation. They're I2-1. And what classifies as capable of unassisted preservation?
So that's obviously a key aspect of proper determination of the occupancy, because you can have a B occupancy where the patients are incapable of unassisted self-preservation, or an I2.1, depending on the number of patients that are incapable of self-preservation. What does that mean? What level of care renders them incapable of unassisted self-preservation? To kind of put this in context, the State Fire Marshal got asked this question a lot of times and issued a formal code interpretation 02-016, that states dialysis patients are incapable of unassisted self-preservation, even though all they might need is a clamp cut to evacuate on their own. That by definition requires assistance from someone to provide that, and that level of care renders them incapable of unassisted self-preservation.
Which is also true for the infusion clinics for the same reason. So with that interpretation, SFM interprets that the same for infusion, people there for infusion, and that will be added to their interpretation.
Now, CMS has a slightly different definition in it. They basically just say, if the person's not able to leave the building on their own in response to a fire alarm, then they're incapable of unassisted self-preservation. But I think the State Fire Marshal definition kind of drives it home a little bit better and gives an example that dialysis renders the person incapable of unassisted self-preservation. So with that in mind, in this particular infusion center, what occupancy classification would this be? Well, these patients by definition are incapable of unassisted self-preservation. It looks like there's more than 5 stations. So this would be an I2.1 occupancy. Is it OSHPD 3 or not? That's not material at this point. Right now, we're just defining the occupancy, and it's important to realize OSHPD 3 could be a B occupancy, or I2.1 could be a non-OSHPD 3 facility. The two are not related to one another. So occupancy classification is based on the patient and the number of patients, and OSHPD 3 requirements are based on whether the facility is licensed or not. So as we figure out now how many people should we count, because obviously all of the buildings that we looked at have more than 5 people in them, the occupancy has 5 or less patients who are incapable of unassisted self-preservation, or 6 or more patients, not the total number of people in the building. So as a rule of thumb, the State Fire Marshal has ruled that if you have one operating room, the code requires that you have a pre-op room. So every operating room requires a pre-op room where that patient may be sedated or incapable of unassisted self-preservation. So now for every operating room, I have 2 patients. And then 1224 requires post-op or PACU at a rate of 1.5 spaces per operating room or major fraction thereof. So in this example, if I have one operating room, I also have a pre-op and 2 post-ops. So that would be an occupant load of 4. This particular example has 4 pre and post-op, but that's okay. The code, as a rule of thumb, says if you have one operating room, you have 1 patient in pre-op and 2 in post-op for a total of 4. This classification would be 5 or less and be considered a B occupancy ambulatory surgical center. Conversely, if you have 2 or more operators, then I have to have the requisite number of post and pre-op at the rate of 1 pre and 1.5 post. That will put me over the 5 number. And if I have 2 operating rooms, you will be an I-2.1 occupancy. Again, OSHPD 3 doesn't come into this scenario. This could be an I-2.1 non-licensed ambulatory surgical center, and OSHPD 3 would not apply. So right now we're focusing on the correct occupancy classification.
So when you have ambulatory care facilities, you're in that B. There are specific requirements in CBC 422 that, as you look through this, even just glance through this, you'll see some familiarity if you're used to work with I2s. But some commonalities, I guess I should say here, is sorry about that, lost my train of thought there. Where smoke compartmentation is needed, if the facility exceeds 10,000 square feet, then they need smoke compartments. There's sprinkler separation requirements, fire alarm requirements, and something that stands out with this one is where 4 or more care recipients are incapable of self-preservation at any time, then the sprinkler protection is required, and we'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a minute. And then separations from adjacent spaces. The separations are also required in a fire partition. Separation is required from other tenant spaces and other public use spaces. And we'll get into that in a little bit more. That didn't come out right. We'll get into that a little bit more later as well. And then, yes, when you have 6 or more care recipients in the ambulatory care facility, it's classified again as the I-2.1, so you go to the I-2.1 requirements. And then for a Group B ambulatory care facility classification, requirements for the sprinkler portion will apply to facilities with either 4 or 5 care recipients because of this section here that says we're 4 or more, where what we've read before talked about 5 or fewer. So Group B, always 5 or fewer. And then for an ambulatory care facility, that again, patients are incapable of unassisted self-preservation, fire alarm systems required. If they have 4 or 5 patients, then fire sprinklers and the separations are required from the other tenant spaces in other areas. And then if it's more than 10,000 square feet, they're also going to need smoke barriers, smoke compartments. And then I-2.1 again is always 6 or more patients.
So that's occupancy classification. Kind of tough, I get it, but hopefully that clears these requirements up. We're going to move into construction types because this is important to understand, and more importantly, it's important to have the correct occupancy classification, right? Because if your ambulatory care facility is a B occupancy, then the number of stories and height and area that are permitted for the B occupancies is very different than what is permitted for the I-2.1. So these are 2 excerpts from table 504.4 that talks about just the number of stories. And using the least type of construction, the type 5B, you can actually be 2-story ambulatory care facility, not sprinklered, or 3-story if the building is sprinklered. But that would not be permitted if the occupancy classification was in fact an I-2.1. So very important to get occupancy classification correct. Another key part of this particular table is footnote N down towards the bottom, because footnote N says in other than A, E, H, I, L, and R occupancies, I occupancy be included in that, you are allowed to increase the area for height and stories in addition to the increase for area. Or said differently, for height and area, you get to double dip. Not permitted for the I occupancies, but it would be permitted for the B occupancy ambulatory care centers. So very important, again, to get the occupancy classification correct. Looking at the height of the building above grade plane, kind of the same thing. The B occupancy requirements are much less restrictive than the I-2.1 occupancy requirements. And again, that B occupancy gets to double dip, stories as well as area. And then allowable area is also another big one that comes in, and the B occupancy allowable areas are significantly increased over the I-2.1. And looking again at type 5B, for instance, if you have a sprinklered multi-story B ambulatory care center, the basic allowable area is 27,000 square feet, which would not be permitted in the I-2.1 occupancy at all.
Just a side note that's helpful for those who don't fall in love with math is the to do the allowable area calcs that you used to do that whole formula or equation, excuse me, do the whole equation to figure out what your allowable area can be. Through the recent additions of the code, there have been some changes to that. You still have to figure that out, but the code has made it easier. I think in 16, they provided factors for that you can just plug in if it's sprinklered or not. You just plug that into your I sub S or your I sub F. Well, now in 2022, they've added a factor that you can add in for your I sub F, which was the more difficult, one to come into play. So when you're looking at that and you're looking at these tables, keep in mind that that's a change that it makes it a little bit easier to figure out what that allowable area increase is, if it is allowed.
Table 601 talks about the various different requirements for the 9 building elements for each of the individual construction types. We'll break these down individually, but if you're not familiar with types of construction, type 1 and 2 are considered non-combustible construction, where type 3, 4, and 5 may have combustible construction elements. This is a nice little slide that kind of shows a bunch of different ways that buildings can be constructed. Everything in the first floor on the left would be non-combustible construction, where the two on the right would be combustible construction. This next little slide I kind of like, which was an interesting build on that previous statement, that even though type 1 and 2 are considered non-combustible construction, only type 5A is allowed to have combustible exterior walls. If you look at this little graph, type 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all required to have non-combustible exterior walls, where type 5 is the only one that's allowed to have combustible exterior walls. So breaking down the different types, this is type 1, typically what you see in multi-story hospital buildings or taller buildings, where we have a structural frame that has a 3-hour or a 2-hour rating. The bearing walls for the exterior and interior are 3-hour for type 1A and 2-hour for type 1B, and so on. The construction difference is not great between type 1A and 1B, but this is the most restrictive construction type, which conversely, of course, allows the most allowed area and height availability in the tables that we looked at earlier. Type 2 construction is broken down into 2 segments. Type A is what we used to call type 2 1-hour. So you see all of the elements have a 1-hour fire protection rating, with the exception of non-bearing interior walls. Type 2B is type 2 non-rated, what you might see like in a Butler building or something like the picture on the left. Everything is non-combustible construction, but no fire resistance rating on any of the building elements. Type 3, now we leave the realm of non-combustible construction and enter into a type of construction where combustible construction elements are allowed. But as you can see, the exterior walls are still required to be non-combustible. And in fact, exterior bearing walls in a type 3, whether it's a type 3 1-hour or type 3 non-rated, are required to be 2-hour fire resistive. Typically, you might see this in a tilt-up style construction, but the interior elements of the building can be constructed with combustible construction. Type 4 is interesting in particular because as we move into a greener kind of a building code and more allowances are being made in the code for tall wood constructed buildings, you see these new construction types, type 4 ABC and then type 4 heavy timber. The ABC classification is sort of moot because currently I-2.1s are not allowed to be any of those types of construction, but they are allowed to be the type 4 heavy timber with those fire protection ratings that you see in the table. And then the least type of construction, which can be fully combustible construction, interior and exterior, is the type 5. And type 5A would have 1 hour fire resistive ratings on the building elements, where type 5B would have non-rated fire resistive elements. This being the lowest type of construction, and therefore from a height and area standpoint, the smallest allowable area and the smallest height of the building. Nancy loves talking about frontage, so just a pointer here that 506.3 requires every building to have a access to a public way and to receive an area factor increase based on that frontage. So the calculation has changed from previous codes. It's gotten much simpler, but the point here is that frontage is required, and part of the classification and area calc deals with this concept of fire separation distance. And fire separation distance is that distance that you see to these various different elements. The distance from exterior wall measured at a right angle to the closest interior lot line, or what we used to call property line. The distance to a center line of a street, alley, or public way, like you see on item D. The distance from the exterior wall to an imaginary lot line between two buildings that are on the same property. And then lastly, number 4, the distance at right angles measured to the face of, shall be measured at right angles to the face of the wall. I already said that. And if that's not simple enough, if you looked at each of those construction type classifications, there was a reference to table 705.5. So to determine the actual required rating of exterior walls, you actually need to look at 2 tables, table 601 as well as table 705.5. So just be aware of that. We're not going to go into any real detail about that, but this is what 705 looks like. The occupancy classifications for Bs and I-2.1s are the same. And essentially this determines when, based on the distance, the fire separation distance to that property building is minimal, then those exterior walls may need to have a 1 hour rating.
As you can see with the note at the bottom there, that table might look familiar to you, but why is it 705.5? It used to be table 602. So if you wondered where it went to 705.5. So incidental uses, there are spaces in these facilities that have a little bit more of a hazard. That could be a additional fuel load, materials that are in the space that will require additional protection. So when you look at table 509.1, you look at what you have occupancy wise. You have an I-21, or is it a B? And there are some additional requirements that come into play here. Highlight footnote A here, because when you have an I-21, you have the requirement for a separation and sprinklers, where you'll see on some of these, they can just have one or the other of 1 hour fire barrier, or whichever rating it needs based on what's in there, or a sprinkler. But when it has footnote A, you would need both the fire separation and the sprinklers. And then the types of rooms that you would see this in, you can see in the pink that I-21 labs that are not classified as H's, but in those are required to have the 1 hour fire barrier and the sprinklers. But in an ambulatory care facility, if that's that B, then they can have 1 hour or the sprinkler system. There are more requirements with sprinklers that we'll get into later, but just for the use of this table, we'll leave it at that. And then again, for the I-21, for laundry rooms that are over 100 square feet, also the 1 hour separation and the sprinklers, and so on. So just remember to look at this table and determine if you have these rooms, if determine what protection is needed for those spaces. Patient drop-off areas, there you'll see in chapter 5, there's in 508, that's part of the code that helps you determine, do I need separation between these mixed uses? Is it non-separated? Is it accessory? And 50824 is under the accessory portion of 508 and indicates that you do not need separation between accessory occupancies and that main occupancy, and then has some exceptions. For an I-21, it doesn't make sense at first because the charging section says, hey, you don't need a separation if it's accessory between the main and accessory. But then exception number 3 says for the I-21s, they have to be separated from all other occupancies in accordance with 5084. 5084 is a table where you'll see the different occupancies. You have an A adjacent to an I-21, is it a B, et cetera. So that has to be, the A would have to be separated. But if you keep reading here, an exception to this is that you don't need a separation between B, E, R2 sleeping units accessory to the I2 or 21, and the covered exterior entrances that other parts of the code require. You don't need the separation between those and the I21 as long as they fall under the accessory limitations, which is 10% or less of the floor area of that use. That doesn't make sense there. So say you've got this S2, so you have these areas that are the exterior entrances that are required by these other portions of the code, 11B and 1224. Those sections will require an ambulance drop-off or a covered patient drop-off. Flip-flop that order. Those sections say you have to have these drop-offs. You have those drop-offs and they're less than the 10% floor area of the different S2s in that space. They can be considered accessory and do not have to be separated. If the building's required to be sprinklered, they're still gonna have to be sprinklered. They're gonna be the same construction type. They're considered part of that building. But again, these are the drop-offs that are just for these code required drop-offs in 11B and 1224. The covered patient drop-off and the ambulance drop-off. It's not for the UPS, Amazon drop-off. It's not for those. And then you'll see additional requirements in 903221 that match that say, hey, you have these, they're accessory, they're considered part of that building. They also have to be sprinklered.
So bringing it back around to type of construction and finishing it off, section 603 actually is one of my favorite sections because while we pointed out that type 1 and type 2 are considered non-combustible construction, 603 offers 27 different conditions where combustible materials can actually be used in type 1 and type 2 construction. So be familiar with this and the 27 items. And specifically for ambulatory care facilities, just wanted to point out that in item number 1, non-load bearing partitions where the rating is 2 hours or less can have combustible constructed walls, or even in type 1 fire resistant buildings. So that rounds us up into now the next section in effective use of the code is determining whether a building is sprinklered or not. So we'll talk about sprinkler protection. Starting off with the B occupancy, ambulatory care facilities, section 422 has a requirement for automatic sprinklers and requires that ambulatory care facilities comply with section 903.2.2. If I jump to 903.2.2, it says an automatic sprinkler system shall be installed throughout the entire floor of a building containing an ambulatory care facility where either of the following conditions exist. So Nancy alluded earlier, if you have 4 or more care recipients, so in this case 4 or 5 incapable of unassisted self-preservation, sprinklers would be required. Or if you have 1 or more above the level of exit discharge. So this again is throughout the floor where the care recipients are located, not the entire building. Now, building on that a little further, when those patients are above the level of exit discharge, this section goes on to say that an automatic sprinkler system has to be installed throughout that floor, as well as all the floors below that floor all the way to the level of exit discharge so that fires that originate on those floors are controlled. I occupancies is a little bit easier. So if it's an I-2.1 occupancy, 90326 says an automatic sprinkler system shall be provided throughout the building. So we don't have to care where the patients are located. Sprinklers are required throughout the building. And a little bit of a side note, for light hazard occupancies, which would include I-2.1s, and specifically for ambulatory care facilities, 90332 requires quick response or residential style sprinklers to be installed. So these are not your standard response or standard spray sprinklers. These are required to be quick response, which is pretty commonplace. Of course, when you have sprinklers and sprinkler systems, you sometimes get a bunch of other things that are associated with it. There are things you might need to be aware of and design accordingly. Do you need a fire pump for your facility? Do you need on-site water supply? Where do you put your sprinklers? Or when you design your sprinklers, how are they located in relationship to other obstructions? Is this sprinkler too close to this cubicle curtain? The answer is actually no, as long as the top 18 inches of the cubicle curtain or the privacy curtain has this mesh style design that you see that has a 1/4 inch space between each of the little cells. What about medical record storage, particularly where these medical records may slide and move and be in different positions that might obstruct sprinkler spray? In radiology clinics, when the pieces are pretty large, do they obstruct sprinkler protection? Or does the gantry slide left and right or back and forth and also obstruct sprinklers? So these are things to please take into account during your design and make sure that the building is, the sprinkler system is designed accordingly to avoid problems at the end of the project when you want to get licensed. And then bringing it around to additional fire protection systems. Most of the time we're talking about fire alarm, but maybe other stuff as well. In 907221 for ambulatory care facilities, this section of the code for these B occupancies requires an electronically supervised automatic smoke detection system installed within the ambulatory care facility and in public use areas outside of the tenant space, including corridors. The code says, however, if the building is sprinklered, then an occupant notification will activate throughout the building when the sprinkler system flows, and automatic smoke detection system is not required. I-2.1, a little more specific and a little more restrictive. 907262 requires a manual and automatic fire alarm system in all I-2.1 occupancies. I'll paraphrase a lot of this section that says you can use audible appliances or must use audible appliances in non-patient areas, but you can use visible appliances or strobes in patient-occupied areas without audible sounding devices. Audible appliances in the patient areas have to be chimes or a similar sounding appliance for staff alerting. The idea is these patients are incapable of responding to the fire alarm, so we don't necessarily want to alert them or cause them undue fear when the fire alarm system activates. You want to turn that down? Thank you. Where an automatic fire suppression system or smoke detectors are installed, such systems shall be connected to the fire alarm system. Now here's a question, a formal code interpretation from the State Fire Marshal's office that is interesting because earlier we mentioned that sprinklers have to be installed throughout the building. What about fire alarm? The question says, where I have a group I-2.1 ambulatory care facility located within a fully sprinklered B occupancy, is the entire building required to have an approved manual and automatic fire alarm system? And the answer from SFM is no. Only the I-2.1 portion and the shared egress would be required to have this fire alarm system installed. When smoke detectors are required, interestingly, there are not a lot of requirements for smoke detection in 907. 907 basically lists these areas. It says you have to have a minimum of 1 smoke detector at a nurse station, centrally located. You have to have smoke detectors in waiting areas and corridors to which the waiting areas are open within the same compartment, assuming the waiting area is open to the corridor. And then if you have, for instance, a psych clinic or a mental health clinic where patients are restrained, then smoke detectors need to be installed throughout all occupied areas, as well as mechanical and electrical spaces, to detect fire earlier, so that we can take an immediate action and get the restrained folks out. Those are the only three required by 907. However, there are numerous other provisions of the code that might require smoke detection elsewhere. And so here's here's a few of them. If you have elevators, obviously you need smoke detectors in the elevator lobbies. If you are required to have air handlers shut down, you may need smoke detectors, automatic closing doors, etc. So these are just 13 examples of other locations that in the code that require smoke detection in addition to the requirements of 907. And then just to kind of bring it all home, there are other types of fire suppression systems that you may have in these various different types of clinics. Some are going to be more prevalent than others. Clean agent systems for IDF rooms and computer rooms. Kitchen hood suppression systems if you have commercial cooking in your particular clinic. Refrigeration machine rooms may require refrigerant leak detection systems. Some of these buildings may require mechanical smoke control systems if you have atriums, for instance, or high-rise buildings. So fire alarm is not the only fire protection system, be all of these others as well. So this is a good place for a question and answer. If you, Monica, if you want to take it, if there are any questions that have been asked.
Oh yes, there are so many questions. And very, very good presentation. I enjoy it. Okay, let's go with the questions. The first one says, who accredits ASCs?
Who accredits ASCs? I thought I had a slide for that, and I do know the answer, but I can't recall it off the top of my head. But I will find out and respond to that question if you submit it to the regs unit email address that Monica talked about earlier.
Perfect, thank you. Next question. If OSHPD is the designated plan reviewer for an OSHPD 3 clinic, does that include also site work?
No, it will include just the OSHPD 3. Sorry about that. It will encompass just the OSHPD 3 provisions. So site work, you're usually referring to accessibility. That's not included in the OSHPD 3 portions. So really we're talking about the section 1226 requirements as well as the MEP provisions that are specific to OSHPD 3.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Gary. Next question reads, if new clinic is built to OSHPD 3 standards for infrastructure purposes, but will be used as a non-licensed clinic, is OSHPD 3 certification required for the MEP infrastructure systems?
OSHPD 3 certification is never required if it's not a licensed facility. So presumably you build the building to accommodate a future licensed tenant, but if you do not have any licensed tenants in the building, OSHPD 3 would never be applicable. I think it's very smart to construct the building with that kind of flexibility in mind, because if you don't construct to OSHPD 3 requirements, the building will probably have a very difficult time of ever having licensed tenants in it. So I think that's pretty smart.
That makes sense. Thank you, Gary. Next question. If a licensed facility chooses OSHPD as the reviewing agent during construction, are NMA and ACD required when changes are made?
Okay, that's a good question. And the only time OSHPD would actually be inspecting the construction or observing the construction would be for those clinics that are in a hospital building, and that would be OSHPD 1 requirements. All of the other ones, if you follow the flow chart, it says if OSHPD does the plan review, they will review it to the OSHPD 3 requirements only, And then those requirements get merged, if you will, into the local building department Title 24 review. And once the plans are merged with all of the Title 24 from the local review and the OSHPD 3 requirements from OSHPD, then the building goes into construction and the local jurisdiction will do all of the inspection, all of the construction observation, and issue the C of O. OSHPD does not get involved in the construction part of the clinic, and so therefore, change orders, ACDs, NMAs do not apply.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Next question. Can clinic move from one licensed space to another licensed space without having to bring the space up to the current OSHPD 3? Does it depend on the type of service?
That's a good question. And the answer is, of course, it depends. If the space is moving from one portion of the building into another portion of the same building, then that new portion would need to be evaluated for OSHPD 3 compliance for that licensed clinic. If you're moving that service to a different building, then that new building would need to be completely re-reviewed for OSHPD 3 compliance.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Gary. Next question. Do we specifically use the term licensor as licensor with CDPH? Ambulatory surgery centers, as mentioned in the webinar, has not necessarily been licensed under CDPH. Do often seek licensor with CMS in order to be a Medicare facility. How we apply the term licensor seems to not include facilities that only need to comply with CMS.
So that's a completely true statement. And when you're using the term licensure in this context, it's licensed by CDPH. And that's why I used when I was talking earlier about those ambulatory surgery centers that are not licensed, they're not licensed, but they are required to be accredited. And the conditions of participation for CMS are really what I think this question is referring to. Those are not license requirements. Those are conditions of participation from CMS. And then CMS usually, as a condition of participation, requires that accreditation from that accrediting agency.
Thank you. Next question. If a local AHA is unequipped or inexperienced to perform a review and certification of a primary care clinic, rehabilitation clinic, or ABC, is it expected that the AHJ is to search out a third-party reviewer? If so, does the third-party reviewer have to meet any required credential to perform said review?
Yes and no. So yes, in those clinic types that we talked about earlier in the flow chart, where OSHPD cannot issue OSHPD 3 certification, then it's incumbent on the local jurisdiction to provide that certification. The code does allow local jurisdictions to hire special consultants at a cost to the owner for specialized sorts of occupancies. And this might be one option where they could hire a CASP or some other specialty group that is familiar with the OSHPD 3 requirements to provide that level of certification. But no, they do not have any licensure or specific certification requirements that go along with them.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you. Next question. By that definition, would a blood donating center be included in that?
Yes, and regarding infusion, dialysis.
Okay.
And that
Is an infusion center required to be licensed? Not necessarily, but it would be an I-2.1 occupancy if it has 6 or more chairs or 6 or more stations where infusion is taking place, because each of those patients, again, are considered to be rendered incapable of unassisted self-preservation. That makes them an I-2.1 occupancy, but not necessarily OSHPD 3. So we mentioned earlier, you could actually be a B occupancy, non-OSHPD 3, or a B occupancy and OSHPD 3, and same for I-2.1. You can be an I-2.1 non-OSHPD 3.
So the individual has an additional question to that, or
And I can read if you want, Nancy.
or with the blood and the blood donating centers. Is that?
There was yeah. And you are
Oh,
right.
okay, I misunderstood the question, I'm sorry.
During the previous webinar on Tuesday, there was a statement that dialysis and infusion patients would be considered incapable of self-preservation. Could you please clarify why infusion is the same category of dialysis?
Yes, I think we actually mentioned that specifically. So infusion is the same thing because the patient can't just get up and walk away on their own.
Right. Thank you. For clarification, medical office spaces that have more than 5 exam rooms will be I-1 occupancy?
Well, depending on what they do in those rooms, it's more than 5 patients rendered incapable of unassisted self-preservation. Generally in exam rooms, that's not happening, but a procedure room, it might be. So it depends on the procedure, or it depends on what's taking place in the rooms as far as whether that patient is incapable of self-preservation or not.
Thank you. Next question. I appreciate the self-preservation discussions for B or I-1 occupancy with respect to the OP surgery example. Is it correct that of imaging modalities, for example, MRI, CT, nuclear med, etc., render occupants incapable of self-preservation, and that 5 or more imaging rooms will trigger the I-1 occupancy?
That's a great question, because I think certain modalities it would not. X-ray, for instance. X-ray, generally the patient is just standing in front of the machine, and they could walk away. Whereas MRI or CT, they may be, they may actually be strapped down, and certainly they're inside of the tunnel and not able to just get up and leave. So. I think the answer there is it depends, but that would be how I would look at it as well. If they are, certainly if they're strapped down to the table and can't get up and leave without assistance, then that would render them incapable.
Got it. Thank you. 4 more questions, and then we can take a break. The question reads: what region will incorporate wood in hospital construction?
What regions would incorporate wood in hospital construction? I don't understand the question. Wood in hospital construction is based on the construction type. It's not a regional, not a regional consideration. So I don't understand the question. Sorry.
So for the person that brought the question, if you don't mind, please send an email to the regs unit at hcai.ca.gov so we can understand better your question. Next question, can you identify the OSFM interpretation regarding assisted self-preservation?
Yeah, the State Fire Marshal formal interpretation is 02-016.
Thank you. Can you please go to the slides 91 and 92, because the question reads, slide 91 and 92 refer to hospital buildings. Are they also applicable to OSHPD 3 building location?
So this is slide 91 and this is slide 92. These are regarding smoke detectors or requirements for smoke detection in buildings, regardless of occupancy type. Is that what the question is asking?
Is asking to, so the slides 91 and 92 refer to hospital buildings. Are they also applicable, these slides, to the OSHPD 3 building locations?
Okay, yeah, you're right, it does say that. So the slide says there are numerous code provisions requiring smoke detectors in hospital buildings. I should have worded that differently, because it would be required, some of these would be required regardless of whether it was a hospital building or not. So for instance, if you have a room housing a fire alarm control panel, regardless of the occupancy type, and regardless of the building type, NFPA 872 would require a smoke detector in that room. And same like mentioned earlier, if you have an elevator, lobby, and a machine room that requires elevator recall, then a smoke detector would be required by section 3003, regardless of the building or occupancy type. So I understand the question now. Sorry for the confusion.
So if, again, the person wants to have a better clarification, send the email to the regs unit at hci.ca.gov. Two more questions. Do structural members need to be rated supporting the rated walls in a 2B building?
Do the structural members need to be rated in a 2B? No. In a type 2B is non-combustible, non-rated construction. So if this occupancy is permitted in that construction type, then the structural elements need to be non-combustible construction, but no fire protection rating is required.
Something I'd like to add to that is we've had facilities in the recent past that with that construction type, but they required separations of uses in that building, that because of those separations that were required, that those had a fire resistance rating of 2 hours, and the code requires the support, anything supporting that rated separation has to be rated the same. So that might add some confusion there, but if you have a need to separate a space from this occupancy and it's required to be rated, then anything supporting that rated construction would need to be rated the same as that separated space. So then if those structural members are supporting that space, then in that case, they would need to be protected.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you. Last question. Can Form STD 850 fire be submitted by the owner instead of waiting for CDPH to request it? And if so, would CDPH accept this form by the owner?
The form is required to be completed by the owner and submitted to the Center Applications Bureau with the application package. CDPH does not create that Form 850. The issue is, however, that even though the owner is required to complete the form, oftentimes when the owner submits the fire clearance request or that Form 850 to the fire department will say, we won't accept it from an owner, it has to come from licensing. That's usually where the disconnect comes from. So in that case, the owner does create the form, submits it to CDPH, and then requests CDPH to basically submit it to the fire department to request the fire safety clearance.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So Gary and Nancy, these are the end of the questions so far. So
Okay,
if we wanted to have the break.
Yeah, we'll take a 10-minute break right now, everybody. So grab a cup of coffee, and you'll see a countdown timer here with a 10-minute countdown, and we'll see you in 10 minutes.
All right. Hope we had a good stretch, good snooze. You ready for some more? So we're going to move into chapter 4, the special detailed occupancy requirements. First off, talk about corridors. So for chapter 407, thank you, is for the I2s and I2-1s. There's a requirement in there for corridors, and those corridors have to be 1 hour fire partitions and continuous to the exits, separated from other areas in accordance with 4073, except for spaces that conform to the sections that we're going to go over briefly after this. So you need the 1 hour fire partition corridors that are supposed to be clear of storage or from any other spaces, but then the code has some allowances for what can be open to the corridor. And the first allowance that's in 407 are for waiting rooms, and waiting areas and similar areas. So these areas can be open to the corridor as long as criteria are met, and you'll see a number of 6, I believe, items that need to be met in order to have these spaces open to the corridor. So what I mean, excuse me, so these are the, 5, excuse me. So the spaces cannot be used, of course, as care recipient sleeping rooms. That couldn't be open to the corridor. Not used as treatment rooms or incidental uses that we talked about earlier. The open spaces has to be protected by a fire detection system installed in accordance with 907. And the corridors onto which the space is open in that same smoke compartment have to have smoke detection installed in accordance with 907, and the entire smoke compartment in which that space is located has to be equipped with quick response springs. And the space is arranged so as not to obstruct the access to the required exits, and then each space is located to permit direct visual supervision by the facility staff. So what are we talking about? You have your corridor, it's required to be rated, and that's to be remain free of storage or obstructions, etc. It has a bunch of other requirements. But the code is saying, hey, you've got areas like waiting areas or similar areas. What are those? Waiting areas can be open to that corridor. Of course, they're what you kind of expect here. Some chairs, some tables. They're open to that corridor if they have the, sorry, the thingy's not working. So you have the reception area. Whoops. Sorry about that. There we go. Thank you. The reception area here, registration area, that gives the direct supervision of that space that's open to the corridor. And in this case, you've got the lobby area and you've got a waiting area. What about these similar areas? What are those? That's part of trying to have these facilities become a little bit more social, more like a home environment. So areas like that dining up top right, could that be open to the corridor? Yes, that could be considered a similar area under certain circumstances. The cooking equipment's not going to be in there, but tables and chairs, sure. Under certain size, sure. It helps people come out into these open areas. There's a state fire marshal code interpretation that discusses that a little bit further. Another area that can be open to the corridor with certain criteria in place are nurses' stations. So those nurses' stations can be open to the corridor, and then there are certain items that can be in that nurses' station, and they'll have smoke detection that's required centrally located, that's above that nurses' station. And then, of course, if it's sprinklered as well. And we have a CAN that, and for those who aren't familiar with the CAN, it's a code application notice that is specifically states what could be in that nurse's station. You know, what size fridge, the chairs, computers, etc., paper. This language will eventually make its way into the code, but in Title 19, I went backwards for a minute here. Title 19 in Section 311 is a section that says that there's no storage in the corridor, the required width has to be maintained, etc. we're going to add a 311D, but the process for Title 19 to go through Office of Administrative Law is a much different process than what we go through for code changes for the building code. So it takes a little bit longer. That section for Title 19 isn't on the agenda for the next couple of years or so. So eventually we'll get that into the code, but for now you have the can to use to see, you've got this nurses station, open the can, open the can, open the corridor, what can be in it. And there's some visuals for you, some examples. You have different types of nurses stations. Sometimes you have that, like that previous slide showed, a central nurses station, but you may also have these charting areas or mini nurses station, like on the right, or a charting area on the left. You may have these other areas as well, as opposed to, or one large nurses station, or in addition to those. So use that can if you have those areas. Another space that could be open to the corridor with certain restrictions are gift shops. That gift shop and its storage space would have to be 500 square feet or less in order to be open to the corridor. As I mentioned, corridors in California for our I-2s and 2-1s have to be fire partitions, and they're 1 hour rated fire partitions. The doors in the corridors, keep in mind this section here is if the building is fully sprinklered. So if the building is not fully sprinklered, there'll be some other provisions that come into play, but if the building's fully sprinklered, the corridor doors do not have to have a fire protection rating unless they otherwise need it, like an incidental use room, for example. That door might be on the corridor, that would have to be rated, of course. But if it's doors to a patient room or treatment rooms or certain offices, they may not need to be rated. They don't need to be self-closing, but they need to resist the passage of smoke. Some examples there. So we mentioned that the doors don't have to be self-closing. That is as long as they don't swing into the required width of corridors. If the doors swing into the required width of the corridor, those do have to have self-closers or auto-closing devices. In glazing, there are requirements for glazing. So you've got this rated corridor wall. Can you have glazing in it? Yes, but then there are limitations. Does it have to be rated? Does it not have to be in, again, this is for in fully sprinklered buildings, then you can have fixed, fully tempered or laminated glass that's in wood or metal frames. You could have that in the corridor walls as long as that glazed area doesn't exceed 25% of the area of that corridor wall of the room. So you're measuring along, if you're in that room, how much of that wall in that room is along the corridor wall. You're measuring that part of the corridor wall, not all the way up and down the whole corridor, just that part of that room and that 25%. And you're measuring to if you got a drop down ceiling tile, you're measuring to that drop down ceiling tile. For the fire partitions, you're not measuring all the way up to the floor ceiling assembly above. And then still on glazing, when you have the total area of glass in corridor walls is not limited. When the glazing is fixed, third hour fire protection rated glazing in approved frames, and the size of individual glazed panels does not exceed 1,296 square inches. So that's a whole other lesson, but fire protection rated glazing is different than fire resistance rated glazing. So if you have more wall space that you want to cover, it's too late now. There are ways to do that, but you would have to have fire resistance rated glazing to get more area that's glazed. Otherwise, you have these other limitations. And of course, we see this, and this isn't really corridor, but you can see the glazed areas in many spaces. There are, of course, egress requirements, and you've used Chapter 10 for your general egress requirements, but 407 has specific requirements for the I-21 occupancies. So you still use 10, but you have to use the specifics here. And in 407, There are, well, let me see if we're there yet. I won't go there yet. Wait, we have these specific requirements because we have a defend in place system. So in most occupancies, you can, if fire alarm goes off, there's an event happening, the occupants can get up, get out. But in an I-2-1, we have these other provisions in place because the occupants can't always do that, or it takes more time. Because it takes more time, more levels of protection are required. That's why there are more specific requirements in Chapter 4. It takes more time to get out. You need a little bit more safety to get out, safety requirements to get out safely. One of these is direct access to a corridor. There's a requirement for habitable rooms in I-2 and 2-1s to have access directly to a corridor.
What is a habitable room, Nancy? What the heck does that mean?
We have a can for that too. But habitable rooms, and that it'll explain it in the can as well. But habitable rooms, it's not, well, skip to here. It's not intended to include individual bathrooms. So the public bathrooms are different, but it's not intended to include individual bathrooms, closets, the housekeeping rooms or spaces like that, as well as the briefly occupied spaces like a control room in radiology, or the medication room directly accessible from the nurse's station, or etc. So there are certain rooms like that that you don't have to look at as habitable. Again, look at the code application notice. For this definite explanation, it goes into it in more detail of what areas does OSHPD look at as habitable versus not, because the definitions, NFPA 101 has definitions and we have it in the building code, and it gets kind of confusing. So that can help differentiate between what's considered habitable and what is not, for figuring out, do you need an exit access door directly to a corridor, or are you okay not having one in a specific space? So you can see the section changed here, 422.2. So still in Chapter 4 for those special uses, but 422 is for ambulatory care facilities. So you'll see similar language here. If you've got that ambulatory care facility, you would go to this section, but there's still a requirement for the separation of spaces. So the corridor space has to be separated with the fire partitions in accordance with 708, and spaces adjacent to the tenant spaces also have to have separation between those other tenant spaces with the fire partition, the 1 hour fire partition. So again, this is just fresh in the memory, your ambulatory care facilities with the 4 or 5 care recipients. If they've got more than that, then you go to the I-2 requirements in 407 that we just talked about. And then back to 407, there are limitations for the basement exits. So rooms below grade shall have not less than 1 exit access that leads directly to an exterior exit door opening directly to an exit discharge at grade plane or the public way. So this picture on the right is not compliant. They have that door and they get outside, but that door is not at grade plane. They have to go up the steps to get to grade plane. So that would not be compliant. So if there are spaces in the basement, they have to have an exit access that leads directly to the exit door at grade plane. And there are requirements for travel distances in the space. Again, it takes more time to relocate patients as opposed to just getting up and getting out. So limitations on distance of travel as well, more stringent limitations. So the distance of travel between any point in an I-2 or 2-1 occupancy sleeping room that's not located in a care suite, and that distance to that exit access door shall not be greater than 50 feet.
So where would you have a sleeping room in a clinic?
Yeah, good question.
It's an important distinction, and the code's going to use this term sleeping room as well as non-sleeping room, and the term sleeping room would never apply to clinics. As a rule, even though patients may be unconscious and appear to be effectively asleep, sleeping room is really patient licensed patient beds in facilities that are 24-hour care or more. So as we go forward, you're going to see the term sleeping room and then non-sleeping room. The non-sleeping room would apply to procedure rooms or treatment rooms, and that's where that would come into play.
Good question.
Thank you.
And then how many means of egress or exit access do you need? So one sleeping room of more than 1,000 square feet, they need 2 exit access doors from that sleeping room. And then any room other than sleeping room, so any other room with an area of more than 2,500 square feet needs the 2 exit access doors from that room.
Notice that's not based on occupant load like other elements of means of egress. This is based on this.
Yes. Oops, sorry. Keep doing that. And then care suites. So we talked about the corridors, and if you've got a design that's set up with the rooms off of the rated corridors, but what if you want just one group, just one big space, like a suite? So there are allowances for care suites in I-21s. And then of course, there's definition in chapter 2 that for care suite. So what is a care suite? A care suite in group I2 or 2-1 occupancies, a group of treatment rooms, care recipient sleeping rooms, and the support rooms or spaces and circulation space within the suite where staff are in attendance for supervision of all care recipients within that suite. And the suite is in compliance with the requirements of 40744. So we won't go through everything, but just touch upon some things here. So you've got a care suite. All right, you can have that. The code always has some give and take. So if in the rated corridor condition, you've got that a higher rating for that corridor allows for a higher level of safety for relocating the building. What about the suite? So, okay, you can have this bigger space, and we'll do some give and take with this space. You may not have to have the rated corridor, but what kind of things do you have to have instead? So exit access through the care suite. Exit access from all other portions of a building not classified as a care suite shall not pass through a care suite. So you've got this suite, areas that are not suites and other parts of the building cannot use this suite as part of their means of egress. But if you have a suite that is required to have more than one exit, one of those exit accesses in the suite can pass through another suite. So a suite can go to a suite for one of their exit accesses, as long as the other requirements of 4074 and 1014-2 are satisfied. Now this piece in red here, if you're looking at the 2022 code, it disappeared. And we don't know if it would publish this error or what, but it disappeared. We're putting it back. It's in the mid-cycle 22 code package that is accepted to be put back in. So we still enforce this the same, where if you have a suite, it can exit. Sorry, I was. Man, I need more sugar. You have this care suite, and they're required to have 2 exit access. One of them can go through another suite. The other has to go right to a corridor or an exit. And clear separation requirements for care suites. It's required to have a 1-hour fire barrier. So you heard me say fire partition before. That in 1 hour, there are different wall types. Please make sure to use the appropriate wall type, because how those openings are protected and penetrations are protected, ducts, etc., have different requirements for different wall types, even if they're both 1 hour. So for suites, they need a 1-hour fire barrier surrounding that suite. And you can see the image to the left there. You've got 2 suites shown. That red dashed line is indicating that's the 1-hour fire barrier between the suites and then around the suites.
One of the significant differences, and the reason I'm emphasizing fire barrier in comparison to fire partition, is how the barrier can terminate, or the section of the code that talks about continuity. Fire partitions are allowed to terminate at the underside of the fire resistance rated floor ceiling or roof ceiling. But if you see at the little diagram on the right, a fire barrier is not allowed to terminate and must continue all the way to the underside of the roof sheeting, deck, or slab above. 407-443 talks about movement from habitable rooms. So now we're back into that habitable room question again, and has a whole bunch of limitations for distance and travel, et cetera. So the little box in blues, basically says that healthcare suites are permitted to have one intervening room where the arrangement allows for direct and constant visual supervision by nursing personnel. Direct means visual, means a person's eyes. Constant means just what it sounds like, 24-hour, 24/7. So direct and constant visual supervision is defined actually by the state fire marshal in one of their interpretations. And one of the questions that comes up pretty regularly is, can I use video cameras to achieve my direct and constant visual supervision? And specifically that interpretation says, no, you cannot. So we are allowed to travel through from my space within my suite through one intervening room. That non-rated corridor outside of the room is considered that one intervening room. And my travel distance limitation from the room to the fire barrier suite boundary is 100-foot maximum. It goes on to say that movement from habitable rooms other than patient sleeping rooms. So this is what you'll see in the clinics a lot. Movement from rooms in clinics shall not require passage through more than 2 intervening rooms. So you see the examples that you have on the black line. I'm going through 2 intervening rooms. The one in red has a maximum travel distance of 50 feet. But the exception says that the distance can be increased to 100 feet if the building is sprinklered and an automatic smoke detection system is provided throughout the care suite. So the black line allows that 100-foot travel distance to the suite boundary. So what do we know about what we've talked about so far? If this is a recovery area or pre-op in a clinic, is a single door down at the end of the room sufficient? Maybe yes, maybe no. Obviously, we don't have enough information, because one of the things we need to know is, what is the area of this room? If it's more than 2,500 square feet, then 2 exits are required. But it's not a sleeping room, so the 50-foot travel distance doesn't apply. But what about the maximum travel distance to the corridor of 100 feet? So all of these things need to be taken into account and drive the requirement for access to 2 exits. 407-446 is going to talk about suites that do not contain sleeping rooms. So if we're using suites in a clinic, these sections apply. Basically, the area limitation for suites is 10,000 square feet. If the suite is more than 2,500 square foot in area, it has to have access to 2 exits. And all of the rest of the suite provisions that we talked about would apply. 407-445 is a new section to the 2022 code that talks about non-patient care suites. And this is something that is sort of outside of the definition found in Chapter 2 for suites, which allows administrative areas to be considered non-patient care suites. So this provision would apply, and the limitations are pretty limited. Basically, it has to be separated from other portions of the building by that same 1-hour fire barrier. The suite can be 10,000 square feet and has to be fully sprinkled, but basically that's the extent of the requirements. We mentioned earlier that corridor in the middle of the suite is referred to as a non-rated corridor, and a fire resistance rating is not required. This section comes right out of section 1020.2, specifically saying that these corridors in the suites constructed in accordance with 407, 44, 45 do not require that 1-hour fire partition rating.
Yes, thank you. So smoke barriers. We talked earlier about smoke compartment requirements in the I-2 ones, and the thank you, the sections 4075 and then 422.3. So the 407, of course, is for your I-21s, 422 for your ambulatory care facilities. The smoke barriers are provided, smoke barriers the wall, so we have smoke compartment story greater than 10,000 square feet used by patients receiving care or treatment, and divide other stories with an occupant load of 50 or more. In that, we have to switch that language around a little bit there, regardless of the occupancy. So those stories would need smoke compartments for relocation purposes. And then you have to have at least 2 smoke compartments in these facilities. And those smoke compartments cannot exceed 22,500 square feet. And they are travel distance from any point in the smoke compartment to a smoke barrier door cannot exceed 200 feet.
Pay close attention, even though the slide refers to section 422, which is a B occupancy that requires a smoke barrier, not necessarily all of these provisions would apply to that B occupancy. So please pay close attention to the 422 provisions for smoke barriers as it relates to this, this section.
And the next few items that we'll be reading or talking about doesn't want to advance. Thank you. So smoke barriers from 70941, smoke barrier assembly shall form an effective membrane enclosure that's continuous from an outside wall or smoke barrier wall to an outside wall or another smoke barrier wall and to the horizontal assemblies. And there's the definition in 2 for smoke compartment has changed in the 2022 code. And it's a space within a building separated from other interior areas of the building by smoke barriers, including interior walls and horizontal assemblies. So your smoke compartment, it's got the top, the bottom, and all the sides. Some forget that and think it's just about the walls. So top, bottom, you're creating the whole compartment, this box, and that's all protected with smoke barrier. I say that because the penetrations and again, and the requirements for that will be different. Like for example, you need an L rating for different penetrations through smoke barriers. So it's going through that ceiling or that floor assembly that also makes part of that smoke compartment that would need to be protected with an L rating as well. And the big piece here too is that smoke barrier wall has to go from outside wall to outside wall or to another equally rated smoke barrier wall. Those walls have to be 1 hour fire resistive construction, of course, be smoke tight, hence the name. They're provided with protected openings, 20-minute doors, 45-minute windows, and 90-minute fire smoke dampers. And you have to have at least 2 means of egress from each smoke compartment, each smoke zone. And a means of egress can pass through an adjacent smoke compartment as long as that means of egress doesn't return through the compartment that occupant started from. So we'll give you a visual for that in a minute. For independent egress, there's a little bit of language that has been added to this section for in 22, or excuse me, I think it was actually 19 mid-cycle, but a means of egress shall be provided from each smoke compartment created by smoke barriers without having to return through the smoke compartment from which means of egress originated, and then smoke compartments that do not contain an exit shall be provided with direct access to not less than 2 adjacent smoke compartments. So if you look at the example on the top, that's a non-compliant example. That smoke compartment number 2 does not have its own exit. And if there were a fire in smoke compartment 1 and everybody was relocated to smoke compartment 2, they're kind of not in a good spot, right? There's no way out. So on the bottom example, smoke compartment 2 still doesn't have its own exit, but it now has that the required access to 2 adjacent smoke compartments, and each of those have their own exit. You don't want to create a dead-end condition. So it's not new in practice, it's just clearer in the code to have that. So if you take a look at this slide up, pay attention up top, there's a red line where the toilet room and the office are. And you can see those doors. So the blue line is representative of smoke barrier. and that red line in this case is, but if that smoke barrier goes along that wall where the restroom and the office are, those occupants in those spaces would come out of their space into another smoke compartment and then have to go to either the left or the right to relocate and go back into that smoke compartment that they just came from. So a better design would be to bring that smoke barrier wall along the back side of those rooms so that when they leave those rooms and they're going into their own smoke compartment, and if they have to relocate, then they can go into these other smoke compartments. There are some exceptions to the main section that we read, the charging section we read that said you have to have the smoke compartment. There are exceptions to this. They don't need the smoke barrier if the I-21 is less than 10,000 square feet. And the area adjoining to the, an area in an adjoining occupancy shall be permitted to serve as a smoke compartment for the I-21 facility if the following criteria are met. All of them. So number one, the separating wall and both compartments meet the requirements of 4075. The I-21 is less than 22,500 square feet, and access from that 21 to the other occupancy is unrestricted. So if that other occupancy, if it's locked, they can't get in there. Obviously, that's not going to work. And then there are additional exceptions that they don't need the smoke compartment, the smoke barrier. If any story not containing an I-2 or 2-1 that is located above a story containing an I-2 or 2-1, because if you think about relocating, if you're on the I-2-1 story, we're not going to take them up in a fire, right? That's bad. Fire goes up too. So they don't need to go up for relocating. For areas that do not contain the I-2 or 2-1, where such areas are separated from the I-2 or 2-1 by a horizontal exit. So if they have that horizontal exit separating those areas, they don't need that other smoke compartment, smoke barrier. If there's a story that is located more than one story below a story containing I-2 or 2-1, they don't need that smoke compartment there, because if you're at the point where you're relocating 2 stories down, it's pretty bad, probably time to get out. And then if there's any story housing only mechanical equipment, they don't need that smoke compartment as long as there's a 2-hour separation, because we don't like to relocate our occupants to mechanical floors. Smoke barriers, well, we don't do this too much, but there's a leakage test that you can have. I'll backtrack a little bit.
So the point here is, I think, since it's my slide.
Go ahead.
Talks about the tightness of the smoke barrier, and smoke barriers are required to be smoke tight, obviously, although there's always going to be a certain amount of leakage, because the first thing that we do when we build this beautiful full height outside wall 1-hour wall is poke holes in it with doors and windows and ducts and conduit penetrations, etc. So the point of 909.5, which talks about how the smoke barriers have to be constructed, lets you know that there is a maximum allowable area for leakage that is permitted. And there's actual calculations that can be done to show what that maximum allowable area is. As a rule, if the building or if the wall is being built sufficiently tight, testing of the leakage is probably not going to be required. But if it's not, if it's questionable, the code does allow the jurisdiction to require leakage testing, and this is kind of a big deal. You know, these door fan tests are pretty significant. They use a pressurization method where they measure leakage, and then a whole calculation is required to show the size of the smoke barrier, the amount of leakage, and determine based on a calculation of whether that's sufficient or not, or too much.
And we did do that in a facility up north. I stay up north. That's the Michigan in me, but up north a few years ago, and it was very interesting to see that test and everything that went into it. But like Gary said, if it's built as it should be with all the requirements in place, you shouldn't have that problem. But yes, there's a question. There's test requirements to to go through to ensure that's smoke tight, that compartment smoke tight. So there are requirements for the openings in the smoke barrier, of course. Following that, we're trying to keep, contain smoke in these different compartments and not let it spread through. So the requirements for the openings in the smoke barrier, so like your doors, there are requirements in 716 specific for the smoke barrier doors. And here, we just put this one exception in here too. In group I221, R21s and ambulatory care facilities where a pair of opposite swinging doors are installed across a corridor in accordance with 70951, the door shall be protected in accordance with 716. So when you have a door, always go to 716 for the extras. The code will have some specifics in certain sections like this. The door shall not have a center mullion. Factory applied or field applied protective plates are not required to be labeled. And doors installed across corridors shall comply with 10.10.1.1. So that section will indicate the size that's required. If you're moving bed and stretcher patients, that's 44. Something that was again, we didn't do this, but it was missing from the code, but it's put back again, was that when you have cross corridor doors and they're opposite, they have to be opposite swinging. So if you got cross corridor doors, they've got to be opposite swinging. So
that would be this slide.
Thank you. So depending what code edition you're in, you may have noticed that language went away, but it was still enforced the same. It's still a 101 requirement as well, but it's put back in the code. So 70951, which we mentioned earlier. So what does that section say? Again, for the I2s, 2-1s, R21s, and ambulatory care, where doors protecting openings and smoke barriers are installed across a corridor and have hold open devices, the door shall be auto closing in accordance with 716.266. The doors have to have vision panels with fire protection rated glazing materials in the fire protection rated frames, the area of which shall not exceed that tested, and their opposite swinging. Again, the horizontal assemblies that support those smoke barriers have to also, they're part of that smoke compartment. They have to resist the movement of smoke.
So just a reminder that the floors, Nancy mentioned earlier, you're building a cube. So the floor below, the floor above, and all four walls are smoke barriers. So in this case, the floors are horizontal smoke barriers, and that's significant because penetrations through those floors are required to be leakage or L-rated assemblies.
So for those auto closing doors that are on hold open devices, they have to close upon activation of the fire alarm, sprinkler, or both. That's not a pick one. That's you got it. It's tied to the fire alarm. They're tied to the sprinkler. There, and then the automatic release of this last sentence is new. The automatic release of the hold open device on one door shall release all such doors within that same smoke compartment. Not new in practice, it's just now spelled out in the code that if that one door that's on a hold open is released, then all similar doors have to also release. And the interior, we talked about the interior finish requirements, your chapter 8 requirements. What material, what classification can your materials be for interior finish? Don't forget your chapter 8, and don't forget the footnotes. There's a discrepancy between the CBC and CFC that we'll clean up. So right now, look at both of them. There's a footnote that isn't as clear in, I think the building code, I think fire code has it proper. There's requirements for flooring and the critical radiant flux class that the flooring can be, make sure that meets. There's limitations for how much the wall can be covered with decorative materials. These allowances differ between 101 and building code. So if you participate with CMS, please make sure you also meet the NFPA 101 requirements. The means of egress, You want to talk about this for a bit?
Well, yeah, this is how every corridor in a hospital looks, right? This is a Cedars-Sinai hospital corridor right here, by God. Yeah. Well, or maybe this is. Corridors are not always completely clear and unobstructed at all times, even though the code requires that they are. So we're going to talk about the means of egress provisions as it relates, of course, to these corridors, as well as all the other elements of the means of egress that are applicable to these clinics.
So the egress components, again, this isn't the code verbatim. You'll find this in the code. We'll have a couple sections here for pointers. But if you've got bed or stretcher patients, then the clear width for aisles, doors, stairs, and ramps have to be 44 inches. And their projections are allowed, but it's specific and limited. So you'll see requirements in 10 that are general, and then you keep reading. You do, when you read code, right, you keep reading. And there are some specifics for the I2s, 2-1s. So there's the horizontal projections are limited to 1.5 inches, but you could have 3.5-inch projections for handrails. And then for the alcohol-based hand rub dispensers, those can project 4 inches, and pole stations can project 4 inches. And then maximum travel distance to an exit shall not exceed 200 feet. So yes, you heard us talk about 200 feet before to a smoke barrier. They have to be able to reach a smoke barrier in 200 feet and an exit in 200 feet. They're not always the same, though they often are. So please make sure you're looking at those individually. There are requirements for the ceiling height. In 10032, it indicates that the charging section indicates the ceiling height can be not less than 7 feet 6 inches above the finished floor. But then you see further down in the exceptions for I2s and 2-1s and 3s, that the means of egress shall have a ceiling height of not less than 8 feet. And you'll see similar language in chapter 12. Why do we have that? Again, the timing and that it takes for relocation, it takes longer. You got bank down capacity, if you got smoke coming up, going up to your ceiling, having that extra few inches allows more time because it gives that smoke somewhere to go before it starts to bank down and come down to a lower level, allowing more time for relocating. There are limitations for protruding objects. For the I2-1s, protruding objects shall not extend more than 12 inches below the minimum ceiling height and not more than 50% of the ceiling area of a means of egress shall be permitted to be reduced in height by protruding objects, like your exit signs, of course. What are those about? About 12 inches, right? So those can protrude down from the ceiling height. And then like this picture shows, you've got other items that can be in there, but as long as they just do not, they're not more than the 50%.
The sign obviously projects or protrudes more than 12 inches down. So there's an important word there, below the minimum ceiling height. The minimum ceiling height is 8 feet, but if I have ceilings that are taller than that, obviously the signs can protrude more than 12 inches.
Thank you. If you've got an elevation change in an I2-1, then the code requires that, and it's serving the non-ambulatory, then the code requires that elevation change to be by way of ramp or a sloped walkway. It's bad if people start tumbling down. Step. You want to take this?
Back to our horizontal projections into the corridors. Nancy sort of touched on this already. The 1.5 inch max comes from this section of the code. And again, this is 1.5 inches into the required width of the corridor. So required is another keyword. If the corridor is wider than is required, then the item can project more. Be cautious of now the introduction of accessibility, because if things project too far and could be an accessibility hazard for people with visual disabilities, that could be a problem. But the basic premise here is horizontal fixture elements, furnitures, fixtures, etc., cannot project more than 1.5 inches, and then here are the 3 exceptions. Handrails can project 3.5 inches, alcohol-based hand rub dispensers 4 inches, and fire alarm pull stations with a cover can project 4 inches.
Go ahead.
Moving into section 1008, which deals with exit illumination. This is not a surprise that the power supply for the means of egress has to be provided from the premises electrical supply. This will be normal power. But in the event of a power failure, spaces or buildings that require 2 or more exits have to have an emergency electrical system that will automatically illuminate all of the following things: aisles, corridors, exit access stairways, ramps, interior exit access stairways and ramps, and so on. I'm not going to read all of those, but maybe the most important one, the very bottom one, in I-2.1 occupancies, the exit discharge stairways, ramps, aisles, walkways leading to a public way or to a safe dispersal area also have to have emergency lighting, not just the landing.
All the way through, so all the way through that public ways, the street, or if they have safe dispersal through that. And keep in mind when you have the different lighting out in those, maybe that parking area, for example, that ramps up slowly for energy purposes. Be careful with that, because that lighting is still required to be on e-power and to provide the minimum lumens within the 10 seconds. So watch the type of lighting that's provided through to that public way or safe dispersal area.
Nancy mentioned earlier the means of egress size of doors has special requirements in these I occupancies. The basic premise says the minimum width of doors have to provide a clear width of 32 inches. What is clear width? Where do I measure the clear width? Clear width of openings with swinging doors are measured at 90 degrees and measured from the face of the door to the stop of the door. This section goes on to say a minimum 4-inch projection is permitted between 34 and 80 inches above the floor. This is for panic hardware. So don't stop reading here, because the state language changes this a little bit, and it says in an I2 or I2.1 used for movement of bed or stretchers, the minimum clear width has to be 44 inches, also measured from the face of the door to the stop. And there are no projections permitted into that clear width for I-2.1 occupancies.
And please keep in mind of where you're measuring, like Gary said, you're measuring from that face, or excuse me, from that, in our case, from the hardware to that stop. We've had people they go from that stop and they measure, it's not just straight out to that imaginary straight line. They take it at an angle. That's not how you measure it. You measure it straight out. So you've got that 44 clear between that stop and that hardware. This is just reiterating, right?
This is a new requirement in the 2020 code, where historically there's always been a provision that says doors have to have a 32-inch clear width. When you have a pair of doors, like the ones you see down on the bottom left that are 2 different sizes, one of the doors has to provide the clear 32-inch width. The amendment from the state fire marshal also says that when 44-inch clear is required, that single door has to provide the 44-inch clear. You can no longer use 2 3-0 doors when a 44-inch clear opening is required.
Thank you. And then panic and fire exit hardware. If you've got swinging doors that serve rooms or spaces with occupant loads of 50 or more people in the I-2.1, then they have to have the panic hardware, and those doors are swinging in the direction of egress.
Moving into section 1011 for stairs, this is a little bit of a tricky section and can often be a pain point for you. In these clinics that are deemed to be I-2.1 occupancies, the code requires 44-inch clear stairs in I-2.1 measured between the handrails. So while a projection of up to 4.5 inches is permitted in all other occupancies, I2 and I-2.1 occupancies have to have the 44 inches clear between the handrails. Where this gets tricky is, if you do the math, 44 inches with handrails that project 3.5 inches from each side would have a required stair width of 51 inches. That means the landings also have to be 51 inches. And where you have switchback landings, like in a typical staircase, the width of the landing needs to be 51 inches.
That's missed. That missed often. So like Gary said, please, it gets tricky. Please pay attention to that, because you're talking about the clear width between the handrails, but when you have your core in your building for your stairs, what is that core required to be? And that's got to take into account that additional space between the handrails, the space between the handrails, and then to the wall and the stringer, etc.
Also, when considering an existing building to bring an ambulatory surgery center or an OSHPD 3 clinic into, that handles or excuse me, that accommodates patients that are bed or litter patients, most buildings that were built weren't built with 51-inch wide stairs. So these existing buildings probably have insufficient stair widths for the new occupancy. And that's really important, because obviously you're not going to be able to change the stair width in an existing building very readily.
So some additional egress requirements. Again, remember, you still go to chapter 10 for the general. One of them that we'd like to point out is that when you have an exit access to an elevator lobby is prohibited in an I-21 occupancy. So if the elevators have an enclosed elevator lobby, the path of egress cannot traverse through that enclosed elevator lobby. Now, if they do something in the course of chapter 30 and put smoke containment in front of those doors, for example, and take away that lobby, that's different. But if it's an enclosed lobby, they cannot traverse through that space. And that's a common setup for some of these clinics. So please watch where the means of egress, the design for the path of travel for means of egress. If there are openings, some people used to call these convenience stairs. They're called exit access stairways as opposed to interior exit stairways. But these are exit access stairways. If you have these in an I-21, they're required to be enclosed with a shaft enclosure. Something else that's missed in some of these occupancies. And then some specifics for the corridor width. So again, you've got requirements in 10, and then you have some specifics in chapter 12. There are some allowances to potentially reduce, well, not potentially, you can, depending on your situation, reduce the width of the corridors. So the minimum width for hospitals is at 8 feet. But if it's a psych hospital, they can, and they're ambulatory, they can go to that 6 feet. It's the service corridors with light traffic can go to 5 feet. The admin areas, business areas can be 44 inches. Outpatient clinics or outpatient departments could have 5 feet. And then some examples there, the lab, x-ray, physical therapy, and occupational therapy that go down to that. And then outpatient clinics or outpatient departments could go to 44 inches in the areas like the waiting rooms, the business offices, doctor's offices, examining rooms.
So this particular section of the code is disconnected from the chapter 10 requirements. So the point here is that even though this section says outpatient clinics can have 5-foot corridors, a new amendment to this section says, oh, by the way, go see section 1020 for corridor widths. And 1020.3 requires 6-foot corridors in corridors serving stretcher or traffic in ambulatory care facilities. So be aware of this disconnect, and the provisions of chapter 10 still apply.
Yes. And that's still in work for cleanup, because there's a footnote that was added to chapter 10 that leads you back to 1224. So that's still cleanup a little bit. So dead end requirements. That the beginning portion of this hasn't changed with the code. So there's an allowance. So where you have more than one exit or access doorway, when that's required, more than one's required, then the exit access shall be arranged such that the dead end corridors do not exceed 20 feet in length. And then a new part of the code, it's in I-21 occupancies where, not all of that is new, but in I-21 occupancies where the building is equipped throughout with an automatic sprinkler system, the length of dead end corridors that do not serve patient rooms or patient treatment spaces shall not exceed 30 feet. So the general requirement is you cannot have dead ends that exceed 20 feet. If you have areas that patients are not in, then you could have a dead end that goes to 30 feet. But please remember, that's only for areas where the patients are not. And then, so again, just to recap some of those requirements for the corridors. The corridors are the 1 hour fire rated walls and ceilings, 1 hour fire partitions, the non-rated smoke tight doors with positive latching. Again, the non-rated doors, that's only unless they're otherwise required to be rated, like the incidental use rooms, those would have to be rated. Your inter-exit stairways would potentially have to be rated. Those doors still have to be rated even though they look like they're in the corridor. But these other doors don't have to be rated. The closers aren't required on patients sleeping in treatment rooms as long as those doors do not open into the required width of the corridor. They open into the room, they don't need the closers. Or if they open into a corridor and the corridor is more than the required width, then they may be able to. But anyhow, can't open into the required width corridor. And then non-rated smoke tight windows. Those have to be all in the corridors. What areas can be open to the corridor? Just to recap again, waiting areas, nurses' stations, doctors and nurses charting areas, related clerical areas, mental health treatment spaces, and gift shops. But please remember to go to the specific sections in Chapter 4 that go further in detail about if you have these areas and they're open to the corridor, what criteria has to be in place. So, Gary,
just winding down the provisions for corridors. All these things that we've talked about are, of course, to provide a clear means of egress, unobstructed to the exit, and all of the best intentions of construction oftentimes get thwarted once occupants move in, but we get that, and the stuff that we're going through are requirements for safe means of egress for these occupants.
You want to? Or you want me? We can tell them.
So now we're going to move away from means of egress and move into other topics. So in this case, building security. We mentioned earlier that building security is sometimes a requirement. A licensing requirement requires a hospital or an alternate birthing center to provide infant abduction security measures. Emergency departments might need to have security measures, or it might just be, desirable to provide security. So a few of the ways that doors can be locked, if you will, from the non-egress side are found in Section 1010. So 1010.212 deals with sensor release electrically locked egress doors. And there are a whole bunch of provisions. I'm not going to go through each of the items in this section, but please refer to it if you're using these electromagnetic locks on the doors. Sensor release is permitted on these doors as long as it's not an H occupancy, and there are a significant number of specific conditions that need to be dealt with.
So it'll be free egress. You'll have these sensor releases, but when you're on the room side of it trying to egress, it'll be free egress, but there are these specific requirements. Similar to delayed egress, there are a lot of requirements for if they're going to have a delayed egress system in the facility. Please really read through those. There are 11 or 13 items, I think 13 now. It's complicated and to actually do the work for these. For us, it's easy to say what you need, but to actually do the work and make these work how you need them to can become complicated for the contractor. So please keep an eye on all those items. But Gary can talk a little bit more about the delayed egress.
Yeah, rather than going into the specifics, one of the criteria here is that delayed egress is only allowed in fully sprinkler buildings. And you see the word "and" is italicized. That's a state amendment that says sprinklers and an automatic smoke detection system. So the note below, C907322, for all the requirements for smoke detectors in these special locking arrangements.
So that can be pretty big. So if you've got an area that has delayed egress, the smoke detection throughout all these spaces, that's a lot of spaces where there'll be additional smoke detection that's needed. And again, the entire building has to be sprinklered in order to have this.
Another way of the code allows locking is for areas housing psychiatric or mental health patients. 10.10.2.14 has some special allowances for electrical locking, electromechanical locking, and so on. Again, the building must be sprinklered and have an approved automatic smoke detection system subject to a lot of conditions. Now, one of the provisions of 10.10.2.14 to be aware of is in the model code in the IBC. If you happen to be looking at that, there is an exception number 2 that allows special locking arrangements for infant security and child abduction prevention. This has not been adopted by the State Fire Marshal's office and therefore is not permitted in these I2 or I2.1 facilities. Delayed egress locking is generally the method of achieving this level of security that we need to keep people from being able to grab and run with a little kid.
Right.
So this is going to be a good stopping point again for a Q&A session. Monica, if there have been any questions that have been asked since we stopped last.
There are few questions. The first one is, what's the difference between fire protection glazing and fire resistant glazing?
Oh, sure, Nancy, you had to open that door.
So it would start. Gary loves chapter 2. If you can't tell our smiling
Absolutely.
words here. So actually, we all do. So fire resistance rated glazing and fire protection rated glazing, 2 different. Yeah, it all looks like glass, but what test those that glazing has to go through is where the difference is. So if you think of the words fire resistance rated, like your fire resistance rated assembly, your fire resistance rated assembly is like your wall, your fire barrier, your fire partition, excuse me. So those are required to go through tests that meet the standards in ASTME 119, UL 263. Similarly, if you have fire resistance rated glazing, that glazing would have to go through those same tests, and so it's tested as a wall, as opposed to the fire protection rating, which would go through a different test. So it's how that glazing is tested. Is it tested as a wall, or is it tested as the opening? And that you would find, of course, with the product data and the test reports that come with that material.
Good, thank you, Nancy. Next
You're
question is, I understand that there could be a whole workshop on this, but what are the differences in seismic requirements for no structural element between OSHPD 3 and OSHPD 1 building?
Well, yeah, you're right. The differences are significant. It's probably easiest to summarize by saying OSHPD 3 facilities only need to meet the structural requirements for a B occupancy. Whether it's an I2.1 or a B occupancy ambulatory care facility, the structural requirements are the same. If they're asking about anchorage and bracing of equipment, the regular provisions of Title 24 would apply to both I2.1 and B occupancy. So yes, equipment, mechanical, electrical, plumbing components do need to be braced or anchored, but it's only in accordance with the regular Title 24 requirements, and special seismic certification would not be required in the I2.1.
Perfect, thank you, Gary. Next question reads, just curious about the treatment area language for habitable spaces. Would support spaces like conference room or offices outside of a nursing unit, but not in a separate occupancy, be required to have direct access to the corridor?
So the code allows for that one section that you saw us reading in 50824, I believe it is the section for accessory spaces. And if that space is meets the allowances to be considered an accessory space, it can also use the exiting requirements for its specific use. So in that case, that would be similar to a B, and they could use the B requirements. It would not have to meet the I2 requirements, but that's as long as that space is accessory, meets the accessory requirements.
And if it's an accessory, and it's considered an accessory occupancy, that's the language of 508. And that accessory occupancy may require an occupancy separation if it doesn't meet one of the exceptions for non-separated accessory occupancies. But the simple answer, as Nancy pointed, is if it qualifies as an accessory occupancy, whether it's separated or not, the means of egress for that accessory occupancy is specific to that occupancy.
Yes, thank you both. Next question, what is the difference between non-flammable and non-combustible?
So again, with definitions. So in this case, we would go to a couple different places. So there's definitions in chapter 2 of CBC. You also have definitions in CFC, and then NFPA have their definitions as well for non-combustible. Non-combustible has to meet 36, is that what it is? ASTM 136. I would have to look up the specific section, or excuse me, specific definition. But to be considered non-combustible, there's a test requirement that it has to meet. You can find that in the NFPA standards. I think that we copied that definition in CFC, but I'd have to double check that. But it is in NFPA. You can find that there as well. So again, certain test requirements and testing standards that those materials would have to be listed to, or tested to, excuse me.
Thank you, Nancy. Now there is one more question, but this is prior the break that we had, and is on slide 61. Is that okay that I read the question?
Sure.
Absolutely.
Okay, so slide 61. Is a sleeping room one for one room, or the area with more than sleeping room totally 1,000 square footage?
If the so you can have, if you have a sleeping room that is more than 1,000 square feet, then that room would require two exit access doors. So if they could have that room larger than 1,000, they would need the two exit access doors. If it's less than, then they would just have the one exit access door. So if is the question more, can that room be larger than 1,000 square feet? Is that the question?
It says, is a sleeping room one for one room, or the area with more than sleeping room total 1,000 square foot?
Yeah, so there's, I think I see where you're going. The answer is it applies to both. If you have a sleeping room greater than 1,000 square feet, two exit access doors are required from that room. If you have a suite of rooms that is greater than 1,000 square feet, two exit access doors are required from that suite of patient sleeping rooms. The number for non-sleeping rooms, or what we would see in clinics, is the same, but it's 2,500 square feet.
Okay, thank you for the clarification, Gary and Nancy. There are no more questions, so if you want to, we can continue.
Excellent. I'm going to pick up the rest of the presentation here. We'll pick up the pace a little bit, because much of the rest of this is just hazards that you may come across in health facilities. These are not necessarily going to be every facility. This may not be applicable to clinics at all, but some of the things that you can expect to find in healthcare facilities, of course, are medical gases, and the requirements for all of these different types of medical gases are specific in NFPA 99 and other provisions of the code. Sometimes these liquid oxygen or bulk oxygen systems need special consideration. So in this particular example, this building is a bulk oxygen facility building, but the windows that you see directly above it are in a school of medicine, and which would put the bulk oxygen too close to the opening. So getting creative with the design was required at this particular facility. Of course, the requirements for medical gases apply to other than just oxygen. So in this case, we're using nitrous oxide.
Hello, Monica.
Certainly
Oh, sorry.
requirement. Gotta mute yourself, Monica.
I
Certainly
realize
requirements. That's okay. Certainly requirements for nitrous oxide, whether it's compressed gas or liquid, have all their own special requirements in FDA 99. As a rule, these things generally require a low pressure gas inlet for emergencies, for the time when there might be a failure with the supply and reserve, or a problem with regulators or something like that. As a rule, if you have your bulk oxygen facility, we prefer that you don't store your flammable gases right next to it, like you see in this picture. Keep the flammables and the oxidizers separate. Perhaps may want to reconsider whether the bulk oxygen facility needs to be directly next to a smoking area. Things to consider. These gas systems, of course, include vacuum as well as medical air. So there's the specific requirements for these specialties is also found in NFPA 99. I share all of these items because OSHPD does have a very comprehensive medical gas storage, piping, and alarm system reminder list. And we update this list every code cycle. So the ones that have been published recently have all of the updated code requirements. And in my experience, when you use these checklists and even include them with your plans that get submitted to OSHPD, it shows that they know that you're doing your due diligence and that you've looked at and made allowances or taken into account everything that is required, which in general speeds up your review process pretty significantly. Another hazard is trash chutes or linen chutes. Sometimes these are prevalent in your facilities, sometimes not. Where these things accumulate in relationship to the building is certainly a consideration. Another types of hazard are laboratories. We see laboratories in hospital settings, but of course in clinic settings as well. These can be clinical, of course, or research or microbiological pathology, et cetera. Imaging, I sort of planted the seed earlier that imaging can be a challenge in some of the clinics that we deal with, especially the specialty imaging, like nuclear imaging. With nuclear imaging, of course, we have radioactive materials to be cognizant of and aware of. Linear accelerators use very, very potent proton beams and other beams for cancer treatment that have special concerns and considerations. Magnetic resonance imagery is very special because a lot of people don't realize how powerful these magnets really are. The magnet is always on. A lot of people don't realize that even though there's not somebody there, that the magnet is still functional. And it's not uncommon to get things that are ferrous just a little too close to the magnet, and this can absolutely be what happens. Even though we usually put big signs on the doors that say, MRI always on, do not enter. What do you suppose is about to happen with this guy's breathing apparatus when he goes in the door? Things to take into account. Moving on, mobile units. Mobile units are very, very popular in hospital settings as well as clinical settings, and have some of these mobile units have some really excellent features built into them that you just pull up on your property, plug in and go. And as a rule, the mobile units are pretty self-contained. However, the connections from the mobile unit to the facility is where a challenge might come in. So, for instance, a tent is probably not going to be sufficient, probably not going to be acceptable. Or something that's constructed of extremely light materials like this may not be okay if it connects to the type 1 building. So these are things to take into account. As of late, more recently, both in a hospital setting as well as some of our clinic settings, the need for surge capacity has presented itself. So surge tents have their own special requirements. Department of Public Health, as well as OSHPD, published a paper on the requirements for these surge tents, where they can be located, what some of the requirements are. And of course, as of recently, we found that some areas that probably were never designed to be surge suddenly became hospitals that require special consideration, or areas that require special consideration. If you have commercial cooking facilities in your clinic or in your facility, these have their own kinds of hazards. When we do a presentation of fires in healthcare facilities, fully 87% of fires that occur in healthcare facilities originate in cooking areas. And not surprisingly, we have combustible materials, we have grease-laden vapors that saturate or cover surfaces with a combustible kind of a film. We have special fire suppression systems that are designed to control these types of fires. Some of these systems are powdered in nature, some of them are liquid in nature. I threw in a couple of slides that, if you see something like this, if somebody, for instance, donates some cooking surfaces and you see that it doesn't fit on the equipment pad, there's probably problematic with that. But fortunately, the contractor extended, the hood system outside of the hood like that, so we know that that's pretty good.
It's being funny, just so you know, don't
Oh,
copy
okay.
this.
That's not allowed. Sorry.
This isn't
Had to
good.
clarify. Helistops, particularly in your tall buildings where you may have clinics, are other hazards that are associated with these facilities. The hazards are, of course, the aircraft itself, but also some special considerations for fire suppression. These fire suppression systems can be automatic or they can be manual, and everybody's heard of the PFAS associated with the AFFF being a carcinogen, and recent code or state law that is requiring these old AFFF foam systems to be replaced. They cannot be replaced just with a new agent. So you have to take out the tank and install a whole new system when these things come into account. If you are moving your clinic into an existing building that has this could come up as an issue for you.
Then you can take a look on SFM's website for more information for that PFAS too. They have some pretty good information there, and detailed information about deadlines and such for that replacement.
If your building has a helistop, there is also an excellent helistop reminder list that has all the stuff that we just went over on a checklist that can be really helpful for you.
All kinds of, speaking of those, I know Garrett told all those a few times, but we have all kinds of reminder lists on our site and they were just
Don't jump to the end.
updated as well. But you'll find them. The easiest way is just Google it, HCAI reminder list. But there is a lot of them.
You're stealing my stuff here.
Sorry, we're sharing.
Moving on, other health hazards. What about central plants? Are there hazards in central plants that you might come across? Refrigeration, boilers, emergency generators, fuel storage tanks that go with emergency generators, medical air compressors, pumps, etc. A lot of requirements for emergency power supply systems. We went over many of the requirements in session 1 on Tuesday. The requirements for the generator include operational considerations, so maybe storage right up against the day tank or right up against the emergency generator could be a problem. Might want to find somewhere else for that. Generators come in a lot of different fashions. They might be small indoor generators, they might be larger outdoor generators. As a rule, they come with some form of fuel, however. So this particular one has a belly tank that has a significant amount of fuel underneath the generator enclosure. They can also be equipment mounted. In this case, this would be a temporary application where you have a temp generator for repair, replacement, or so on. The generators come with their own sets of hazards. So these things run pretty hot. In this particular example, we were doing commissioning of this generator, and the exhaust got so hot it actually ignited the building and caught the building on fire. So things to take into account. There's a very extensive emergency power supply system generator reminder list on the OSHPD website that Nancy just jumped to the end and alluded to. With the generators come fuel storage, and in a fire protection standpoint, fuel storage for combustible and flammable liquids is always problematic. It's always challenging. The building code regulates fuel storage by limiting the total capacity of fuel storage that you're allowed to have within the buildings. This particular case is a day tank that may be a 60-gallon tank. Is that okay? And the answer is maybe. It really depends on where this particular tank is physically located. The higher you are in the building, the number of stories that you are located, the less amount of hazardous materials that you're permitted to have. So the question often gets asked, can I have emergency generators on the roof? And the answer is yes, but you may not be able to have the day tank on the roof, depending on how high you are. Things to take into account. Outdoor storage is a little less restrictive. Above ground storage tanks usually require some form of additional protection, like diking. In this case, these are protected above ground storage tanks, literally bulletproof. You can fire a bullet at this tank and it will not penetrate the inner part of the tank. There are above ground fuel storage reminder lists on the website that are very comprehensive. But if you really need to store a lot of fuel, you want to put that underground. So the requirements for underground storage are just as comprehensive, and we have a wonderful underground fuel storage reminder list for those locations. Moving on to the central plant, what about chillers? Well, go ahead.
Well, one thing I was going to add with somewhat related to generators is you may be seeing some more of the battery systems and these other sources of power. So please remember, if you see these, there are additional requirements in CFC. So whether it's locals or OSHPD, there are requirements in CFC specific to these components that you may start seeing more frequently, and including distances from the buildings, all kinds of information. But please go to CFC 12 if you start to see some of the solar photovoltaic, the batteries, fuel cells, etc. Just a reminder there to go look at chapter 12. That's not the only chapter, but start there. Let me know if you have questions, because there's a lot more to it.
That was very helpful.
Thanks. At least it gave it.
Moving on to the other part of the central plant, how about chillers and refrigerators? Chillers in and of themselves aren't overly hazardous, although the refrigerant certainly can be, depending on which refrigerant is being used. With the refrigerants that are hazardous or may result in a simple asphyxiant condition, vapor detection alarm systems are required in these facilities. These alarm systems are required to be located in such a place that it's likely to detect the refrigerant. So if the refrigerant is heavier than air, the sensors need to be down along the floor. They need to have the types of sensors for each of the refrigerants that might be in the room. The leak detection system has to have audible and visible alarms that are unique and dissimilar to the fire alarm system. So we don't want people to think that this is the fire alarm. They need to know this is a refrigerant leak. The gas systems themselves are not all that unique. However, there is a code requirement that the power supply for leak detection system be the same as is required for fire alarm systems. So I have to have the same style of circuitry as well as battery backup. This is probably not what the code had in mind with a bunch of receptacle style plugins. Most of these refrigerant machinery rooms require some form of a purge system, so I might have to have an automated fan system completely capable of exhausting and purging the room, as well as emergency power off buttons located outside of the room to kill power for fire department use and entry. Hopefully that fire extinguisher is just being serviced and isn't like gone permanently. On the outside of the room, there needs to be some form of a control system that the fire department can use to control the different flow parameters of the air. And all this is specified in Chapter 11 of the Mechanical Code. Because this is another one of those complicated topics, OSHPD website for these. Moving on to boilers, what's the real hazard with boilers? Well, they get pretty comprehensive, but really the real hazard with boilers is natural gas. And the natural gas needs to be installed in a manner that's consistent with the plumbing code and what the code allows. Above and beyond that, these aren't overly hazardous, assuming that the various different pressure relief and temperature relief is available on these. Again, the piping needs to be adequately braced and adequately anchored, as we talked about earlier with somebody's really good question. But other than that, there are not a lot of special requirements. Cooling towers may be prevalent on your facility and may be required. Are cooling towers hazardous? Usually not while they're operational. However, when they are allowed to sit or they're taken out of service, the wood has there's a special thing that happens to the wood that creates a very highly combustible situation in these things, and they burn really, really readily. Other things we're going to see pumps. Pumps might be for water, domestic water. They might be for sewage. It might be for other things. Certainly, we might see fire pumps. We sort of alluded to that earlier. Fire pumps can be electric driven. They might be gasoline or diesel engine driven, and so forth. And then winding it down, what about biohazard waste treatment? Sometimes facilities have their own biohazard waste treatment, which involves incinerating the biohazards on site. Those can be hazardous, obviously, to firefighters or people that are in the areas, and special considerations should be made for those. Radioactive materials, we sort of touched on that earlier with nuclear med. Sometimes radiation detection systems may be required, and certainly radioactive medical waste storage has to be part of a plan and approved by various different agencies. So I know that was fast, and it was intended to be really all I wanted to point out on each of those special hazards is that OSHPD has created some pretty comprehensive reminder lists, and I would really recommend taking advantage of those and using those, because there are lots of different hazards that you're going to see in these health facilities that we're going to be tasked with mitigating. So this is it. We're going to wrap this up. When talking about fire protection systems in clinics, the life safety components have to be provided and maintained. So all these things we've been talking about, fire resistive assemblies, smoke barriers, means of egress, fire protection systems, critical care systems, all need to be not only installed correctly, but maintained properly. And last slide, just to sort of drive it home, the enforcement of OSHPD 3 requirements generally fall under the local building department. And local fire department does not really enforce OSHPD 3 requirements. However, they will be out there to look at all those things that we talked about when issuing the fire clearance. And that is all I have. We have plenty of time for additional questions and answers, if there are any new ones, Monica.
And I'm turning on the microphone now. There are only a couple questions. The first question reads, a lot of this afternoon session relates to fire and life safety requirements. Is it correct that OSHPD certification review includes only architectural, mechanical, electrical, and plumbing, and does not include review or certification for the fire life safety?
Yes. However, the idea of this particular presentation is to familiarize everybody with clinic requirements, which obviously include occupancy classification, construction type, allowable area, height and area. Not OSHPD 3 specific, and that's kind of what I alluded to at the very beginning. This part of the presentation might not be OSHPD 3 specific, but it would be applicable to clinics, which is what our presentation today was supposed to cover.
Very good. Thank you so much, Gary. And looks like the last question. Are PPE cabinet allowed in an alcove in a rated I2 corridor if they don't project into the 8-foot clear width and do not affect the rated wall integrity? My assumption is no, but I'm seeing this in hospital outside California.
I'm sorry, did you hear what kind of cabinet?
PPE cabinet.
Oh.
so-
PPE cabinet.
Gotcha, understood. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Nancy, this is like one of your favorites.
No. So-
There's been a little bit of back and forth about that, and you've probably experienced differing opinions. We're building a facility right now that has a brand new facility, hasn't actually been occupied yet, that has PPE, I won't call it cabinets, but it has PPE stations immediately adjacent to each corridor door to each patient room. And that was reviewed and approved by OSHPD. So this is sort of a balance between the provisions of Title 19 that really try to limit the amount of combustible fuel loading that you might see in a corridor egress system and the need for patient and staff protection. So that's my observation. I don't know if there's any specific policy you want to touch on above and beyond that.
No.
Okay, so I got, actually now people, I don't know what happened, but now there are questions. Okay, so the next questions, oh boy, okay. Reopening a closed hospital requires what code requirement?
Oh.
Reopening a closed hospital.
Requires what code requirement?
Well, that's a pretty open-ended question. There are a lot of
So the person, if you want, they can send the email if you prefer.
There's a lot that goes into that. So maybe an email with a specific question, because there's really a lot that goes in, that could go into that answer, depending on what they're
What
specifically.
it is.
particularly what the new use will be. I'm assuming reopening it to use it for something other than a hospital. So
Right. So please, for the email, please send to rexunit@hci.ca.gov. Next question, what about PV solar and EV vehicle charging station?
For the solar requirements, that's part of that chapter 12 requirements that I was talking about, CFC 12. That's not the only location, is what I was referring to before. But start with chapter 12 in CFC 12. I think solar photovoltaic, I believe, is 1205. And there are code requirements in chapter 5 for those solar photovoltaics, and they're going to differ for, of course, if the array is on top of a building versus on the ground, and or above parking. So there are different requirements for each type of the systems that would come into play, as well as requirements for distances to the building. That has to come into play as well. As far as the charging stations, C12 doesn't address that unless they also include some of the battery storage, backup battery storage as well.
as far as whether they are required or not, I think David Cram covered this on Tuesday, unless you missed that particular presentation, because Green Building Code is requiring these sustainable considerations in new buildings, and that really is a local jurisdiction question as far as what they adopt and require.
Gary, David speaking. I can maybe answer this. California Energy Code nowadays requires solar systems. It just came into the codes. It wasn't used to be, but now solars are very prevalent because of the energy code. And electrical vehicle charging stations are also now specified in green building code. So when it comes to local agency approval of clinics for brand new facilities, they will be considered and they're a part of the code compliance issues. So if an architect or design professional is planning a new facility, they should check with the California Green Building Code, Energy Code, and local jurisdiction. But yes, the answer is yes. Those are required for the HCAI 3 clinic projects that go through local government.
Thank you, David. And keep a lookout too. We're creating a guide for these different systems to help the design professionals, help the user with these, because they can get pretty complicated, even though it seems that they're not. And that's not published yet. It'll be some time for that to come. But keep an eye out for that too. But thank you, David, for that clarification.
Yes.
Thank you. And do you want to add any more things for this question? Or I
Nope,
go
that's
to
good.
the next one? Okay, actually the last question, unless while I'm reading somebody will send more questions. The question reads, with regard to medical gas storage, the picture showed medical gas in use connected to main fault with one chain across several cylinders. Does each cylinder needs its own chain, or what determines the acceptable provision to protect cylinders from falling? And there is the reference of the NFPA 99-5133210, and continues say, does the building type impact this?
Okay. Well,
Medical gas storage.
Okay, that was what we call a compound question. Yes, the cylinders have to be secured from overturning. And yeah, the slide did show a picture of cylinders with one chain. There are actually other chains in that picture lower outside of the photo. But the simple answer is whatever mechanism is being used to secure the cylinders, it needs to be adequate. And I know adequate isn't definitive. It's not very prescriptive and say you must have one chain within 12 inches of the floor and one chain within, it doesn't go into that level of detail. And there are more than one way to secure cylinders. It doesn't necessarily say each cylinder has to be individually bolted to the wall, but it needs to be sufficient and adequate to keep the cylinders from overturning.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gary. I don't see more questions, just people messaging me directly saying that this is an awesome presentation. So I want to share with you live about these comments. It's been great. Do you have anything more to add, or do we wrap up? Actually, there is one more question. As an outpatient service, is it acceptable to be OSHPD 3?
Yes. Is an outpatient service of a hospital acceptable to be OSHPD 3? Yes, if it's in a freestanding building. If it's an outpatient service in a hospital building, it is OSHPD 1.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Gary. That's all. So do you want to add any more things, or you want that I wrap up? What do you prefer to do? Because there is time.
No, I think I'd rather give people the gift of time and just say thank you all for presenting. It's really wonderful to see so many people participating in these webinars, and the questions have been spot on, really, really good questions, really thought-provoking. Some of them have been harder to answer than others. But if you have additional questions, or if you ever want to reach out to me personally, or any of the presenters, I think, speaking for them, one of the first slides has our phone numbers and emails. Speaking for me, please feel free to reach out anytime, and I'll be happy to talk to you about anything that you might be experiencing.
Same here. Reach out reach out to Gary first. I'm just kidding. You can reach out to me as well. It's fine. And I really, just kidding. I thank everybody for attending. I know there's a long couple of days here, but a lot of great information. I did notice, Monica, if you don't mind, I did notice a question coming in about OSHPD 1. We are in the process of forming a seminar organizing a seminar for tips from the experts. And that will have a lot of information in there too, but that's, if you want something like this, it would have to be in a series for sure, but it's something that we've been looking at for additional training. But yes, thank you everybody for attending and thank you, Gary, for your work on this as well. And our whole team here behind the scenes, with Monica, Caesar, and everybody, Kelly, everybody back here. Oh, thank you very much for all that you're doing to help.
Of course. Thank you all. So this brings us to the end, believe it or not, of our presentation. And we hope you all found these webinars really helpful. Please remember, if you didn't download the PDF handout, you can find it at the download under the handout section of the GoTo toolbox. And it has been recorded, this webinar, so will be uploaded to HCAI website in approximately 4 to 5 weeks, as we said at the beginning. If you have any question or if we didn't answer to some of the questions that you posted about this presentation, please email to rectunit@hcai.ca.gov. It has been a pleasure being with all of you today. Thank you for what you do and for doing your part in providing access to safe, quality healthcare environment throughout the state of California. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you too, David.
You're welcome.
Thank you.